Hey friends! Glad you're here at Arcane Paradox. We've cooked up something special. What if Sorting Hat found 38 Horcrux fragments in Harry and demanded Dumbledore's arrest? Liking and subscribing really helps us out. Okay, story time. Chapter 1. The weight of a name. The Sorting Hat smelled like old libraries and something else. Something Harry couldn't name. Something that reminded him of the cupboard under the stairs when the air got very still and the darkness felt like it had texture. He'd been waiting in the line of first years for 20 minutes, trying not to stare at the ceiling, which was doing something impossible with stars and candlelight, trying not to think about how his shoes were slightly too small because Dudley had worn them first and stretched them wrong, trying, mostly, to look like he belonged here. He didn't feel like he belonged here. He never felt like he belonged anywhere, which was something he'd stopped thinking about years ago because thinking about it didn't help anything. The girl ahead of him, Granger, the one who'd known everything on the train, got sorted into Gryffindor in under 30 seconds. She walked to the table with her chin up and Harry thought she looked more relieved than happy, which was interesting. The red and gold table applauded with moderate enthusiasm. Harry filed that away. Potter, Harry. The hall went strange. Not quiet, it was already quiet, but a different kind of quiet, the kind that has shape and weight. Harry heard people whispering his name back and forth like they were confirming it to themselves, and he walked to the stool because there was nothing else to do, and Professor McGonagall set the hat on his head, and the darkness came down. Then a voice, old in a way that made Dumbledore sound like a child, old in a way that felt geological, said, directly into the center of his skull, "Hello, Harry Potter." Hello, Harry thought back, because it seemed rude not to. "I've been doing this for 1,000 years, the hat said, and there was something in its tone that Harry would later identify as the very specific weariness of something that has seen too much. "I have sorted dark wizards and light ones, cowards and heroes, the brilliant and the catastrophically stupid. I have never, not once, in 10 centuries of this, encountered anything like what I am encountering right now." Harry felt something shift in the way you feel a storm shifting before the lightning. "Is that bad?" he thought. "I'm going to need a moment," the hat said. And then it went absolutely silent, and Harry sat on the stool in front of the entire school with the musty old hat on his head while presumably everyone watched him do nothing, and he thought about how this was, actually, pretty consistent with how his life had always gone. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20. He could hear people shifting in their seats. Somewhere at one of the long tables someone whispered something and was immediately shushed. Then the hat spoke again, and this time it wasn't speaking into Harry's mind. It was speaking aloud, with a voice like something cracking open, stone, or ancient wood, or something that had been sealed for a very long time. "Stop." One word. But it wasn't the volume that froze the great hall, it was the authority in it. Something so old and absolute that every human being in the room felt it in their chest like a second heartbeat. Professor McGonagall took a step forward. "I beg your pardon." "I said stop," the hat said, and now there was heat in its voice, something that had been sleeping for centuries and was not pleased to have been woken up. "Do not touch me. Do not remove me. What I have found in this boy's mind requires," a pause, and in the pause Harry felt something moving through him like fingers sorting through files, careful and thorough and utterly without mercy, "requires that I speak. Now. In front of witnesses." The great hall had gone the kind of silent where you could hear individual candle flames. Dumbledore rose from his chair at the high table. He was very still, the kind of stillness that Harry would only later understand wasn't calm but control. "Perhaps," he said, his voice warm and carrying with the ease of a man accustomed to filling large spaces, "we might discuss whatever concerns you have in private, no." The hat's voice could have cut glass. "You do not get to make this private, Albus Dumbledore. You have had 11 years of private. You are done." Harry, sitting very still on the stool, thought, "Something is very wrong here and also very right here and I should pay attention." "I am Godric Gryffindor's voice," the hat said to the hall, and the words landed like stones dropped in deep water, sending ripples through every person in the room. I was made to find the truth in young minds and speak it plainly. I am not capable of deception. I am not capable of politics. I am not capable of deciding that some truths are too inconvenient to say. Another pause, and when the hat spoke again there was something in its voice that might have been grief, if a 1,000-year-old magical artifact could grieve. In the mind of Harry James Potter, I have found 38 fragments of a foreign soul. Someone screamed. Harry couldn't tell where from. Dark soul magic, the hat continued, implacable, of the variety created through the act of Horcrux making. 38 separate fragments, each one distinct, each one bearing the signature of Lord Voldemort's magical core. This child has been used as a vessel. He has been, the hat's voice dropped half a register, stuffed with them. Systematically. Over the course of years. And the only person in the wizarding world with both the knowledge and the access to have done this, enough. Dumbledore's voice had lost its warmth. It was still controlled, still precise, but the warmth was gone, and what was underneath wasn't cold exactly, it was something more like resolution, and somehow that was worse. The only person, the hat said, louder now, with both the knowledge and the access is standing at the high table. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. And I, Godric's voice, speaking on behalf of the 4 founders who built these walls and the oaths sworn into them, am demanding that someone in this hall with the authority to do so place this man under arrest. Immediately. Tonight. Harry took the hat off his head. Not because anyone told him to. He just felt like he should be looking at the room when he heard the rest of this. He held the hat in his hands and looked at the great hall full of witches and wizards, at the 4 long tables of students with their faces doing 100 different things, at the high table where the professors had gone rigid in their chairs, at Dumbledore standing very still with his long fingers resting on the table, and at Professor McGonagall who was looking at Dumbledore with an expression that Harry couldn't quite read. It was the expression of someone who is discovering that they have been doing arithmetic wrong for a very long time. Professor McGonagall, Harry said. Everyone looked at him. He hadn't meant it to be loud, it wasn't loud, actually, but everything was so quiet that his voice carried easily, and he supposed that sitting on the stool at the center of everything meant people were already oriented toward him. McGonagall turned to look at him. Her face was complicated. What's a Horcrux? Harry asked. The simplicity of it, a boy, 11 years old, holding the sorting hat in his lap and asking a genuine question in the middle of what had just become the most destabilizing moment in Hogwarts history, seemed to knock something loose in the room. He heard a sound from the Gryffindor table that might have been a nervous laugh, and from the Slytherin table what sounded like several people exhaling at once. McGonagall opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. She was someone who always had words ready, Harry sensed, someone who had spent decades being exactly as prepared as a person could be, and watching her search was strange. She started. It is an object, Dumbledore said, or in very rare and very dark cases, a living vessel, into which a dark wizard has placed a piece of their own soul, in order to anchor themselves to life. He looked at Harry as he said it, and his blue eyes were still behind their half-moon spectacles, still and watchful and giving nothing away. A Horcrux cannot be destroyed by ordinary means. It is, by its very nature, a violation. Right, Harry said. He thought about this for a moment. So you're saying there are 38 pieces of Voldemort, he heard the flinches at the name and ignored them, inside me. The hat has made that claim, yes. The hat that cannot lie. A muscle moved in Dumbledore's jaw. Just once. The hat is a remarkable artifact. But no magic is, I cannot lie, the hat said, from Harry's hands. Its voice was quieter now, almost conversational. I was made that way. Godric Gryffindor believed that the most courageous thing a person could do was see clearly. I am the instrument of that belief. I have not been wrong in 1,000 years and I am not wrong now. Harry set the hat back on the stool beside him and stood up. He wasn't sure why standing felt important. It just did. So, he said, looking at Dumbledore, what are you going to do about it? It was exactly the wrong question to ask if you wanted to appear frightened, and exactly the right question to ask if you wanted to know what you were dealing with. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment, really looked, the way very few adults ever had, and something moved behind those eyes that Harry couldn't name yet. Perhaps, Dumbledore said, Professor McGonagall. This was a new voice, Professor Flitwick, small and sharp and suddenly very upright in his chair. The hat is a Hogwarts artifact. Its findings are Hogwarts findings. There are protocols. The hat has never invoked those protocols, McGonagall said, and her voice was very careful. No, Flitwick agreed. It hasn't. Until tonight. The two of them looked at each other across the high table, and something passed between them that bypassed Dumbledore entirely, and Harry watched it happen and understood, without being able to explain how, that the world had just pivoted on a very small hinge. McGonagall turned to face the hall. She was very tall when she wanted to be, Harry thought. She drew herself up and became, in that moment, less a person and more an institution, and she spoke in a voice that had no wobble in it at all. The sorting will be suspended for this evening. Her eyes swept the student tables. Prefects, please escort the students to their common rooms. All students, including the first years, who will be assigned dormitories provisionally this evening and formally sorted at a later date. She paused. Mr. Weasley. A red-headed boy at the Gryffindor table straightened abruptly. Older, 5th year, maybe, from the badge on his chest. Percy, Harry would later learn. Yes, Professor. Gryffindor students. Now. Yes, Professor. The hall began to move with the particular controlled chaos of a large group of people who want to gawk but have been told firmly to leave. Heads turned. People were whispering. Harry heard his name in fragments, Potter, Horcruxes, Dumbledore, 38, and he stood at the stool and didn't move because no one had told him to move and he wasn't going to pretend he was a regular first year going to a common room tonight. The red-headed boy from the train, Ron, was being herded toward the doors with the rest of Gryffindor. He looked back at Harry once. Their eyes met. Ron's face said I have absolutely no idea what is happening and Harry thought his face probably said the same thing but he hoped it also said I am not panicking about it because panicking wasn't going to help anything. The hall emptied in about 4 minutes, which Harry thought was actually quite efficient. What was left, Harry? The high table's professors, most of whom had not moved. Dumbledore. McGonagall. The sorting hat on its stool. And the ghosts of the school, who had drifted from their various positions to cluster near the high table like silver smoke, watching with the particular fascination of beings who have seen everything but can still, apparently, be surprised. Harry, Dumbledore said, and his voice had gone gentle again, which was more alarming than when it had lost its warmth. I think, given what has been alleged tonight, you must have a great many questions. I do, Harry agreed. And I want you to know, whatever you may have heard in the last few minutes, I have always had your best interests at heart. Harry thought about the cupboard under the stairs. He thought about 11 years of a world that everyone now seemed to agree he had been meant to be part of, and no one had come to tell him. He thought about 38 pieces of someone else's soul apparently living inside him like unwanted tenants, and the only man who supposedly knew enough to have put them there was standing in front of him saying I have always had your best interests at heart. With respect, Harry said, and he didn't feel angry, which surprised him, he felt very clear, the way he sometimes felt when something went quiet in his head right before something difficult, that seems like something you'd say regardless of whether it was true. Professor Sprout made a sound like a quickly suppressed cough. Dumbledore looked at him with those blue eyes, and now there was something in them that was almost, respect. You are very much your mother's son, he said, softly. I don't know what that means, Harry said. I didn't know my mother. Which is something else I'd like to talk about eventually. Albus. McGonagall's voice was quiet, which made it somehow louder than anything else in the room. The hat has made an allegation under founding protocol. You know what that means. Minerva, you know what it means. The silence between them was very old. Harry could feel the history in it, decades of working alongside each other, of trust built up like layers of stone, and something underneath it that had just developed a crack. It means, Dumbledore said, and for the first time tonight he sounded something other than controlled, not broken, not afraid, but tired, which was somehow the most human Harry had heard him, that the hat's findings must be reported to the Ministry. Tonight, Flitwick said. Yes, Dumbledore agreed. Tonight. And it means, McGonagall said, and her voice went quieter still, which Harry was beginning to understand was a specific kind of dangerous, that until the Ministry's examination is complete, you are, provisionally, restricted from making independent decisions regarding the student named in the finding. The student is 11 years old, Dumbledore said. Yes, McGonagall said. He is. They looked at each other, these two people who had been on the same side for 30 years, and Harry watched the look and thought about how the most interesting moments were never the dramatic ones, they were the moments right after, when people decided what they were actually made of. Dumbledore inclined his head. Very well. It was, Harry would later think, the most frightening thing he'd ever heard anyone say. Not because of what the words meant. Because of the absolute certainty in them that this was a temporary inconvenience, that the outcome was still, in all the ways that mattered, already decided. He was going to have to do something about that. McGonagall turned to him and her expression changed, softened in a way that he suspected she didn't let it do very often. Mr. Potter. I'm going to need you to come with me. Where are we going? My office, initially. I need to contact the Ministry. She hesitated, and in the hesitation he saw something that looked like she was trying to figure out how honest to be with him, and then she seemed to decide. This is going to be a difficult night. I want you to know that whatever happens in the next few hours, you are not in trouble. You haven't done anything wrong. I know, Harry said, and she blinked, because she'd clearly expected reassurance to be more necessary. I didn't put 38 pieces of dark magic in myself. That would be impressive, but I didn't. He picked up the sorting hat from the stool, because leaving it there felt wrong somehow. Can I bring this? McGonagall looked at the hat, and then at Harry, and something in her face did a complicated thing. Yes, she said. I believe you probably should. He fell into step beside her, and behind them he heard Dumbledore begin to speak to someone in a very low voice, and he heard Professor Snape respond in an even lower one, and he didn't look back. The hat, held loosely in his hands, said nothing. But Harry had the distinct impression that it was paying attention. McGonagall's office was 2 floors up and smelled like parchment and the specific kind of order that belongs to people who are dealing with chaos all the time and need one corner of the world to stay sane. She sat him in the chair across from her desk and conjured a cup of tea, which he took because it gave his hands something to do, and then she sat down and looked at him with an expression that he recognized. Finally, it was the expression of someone who has prepared for many things but not for this, and is doing the job anyway. Do you feel all right? She asked. Harry considered the question seriously. I feel like I normally feel, he said. Which I suppose is the interesting part. What do you mean? I mean if there are 38, whatever they are, inside me, I've presumably had them for a while. So however I normally feel is how I feel with them inside me. So I don't feel different. He thought about it. Actually, that's not quite right. I feel, he stopped, because the word that came to mind was explained, and that sounded strange. I feel like some things make more sense, he said instead. I used to think something was wrong with me. Maybe it's not wrong. Maybe it's just, extra. McGonagall looked at him for a long moment. You are a very unusual child, Mr. Potter. I'm starting to think that might be an understatement, he said. She almost smiled. Then she reached for her quill and a piece of parchment, and Harry watched her write in a precise, angular hand, and the fire in the fireplace flared green as the letter was sent, and things began to move. The first Ministry official arrived 37 minutes later. Harry counted, because counting things was something he did when he needed to stay steady. He was still in McGonagall's office, still holding the sorting hat in his lap, and the tea had gone cold, and through the walls of the castle he could hear the particular low-frequency hum of a building full of people all talking about the same thing. The official was a woman named Amelia Bones. She was square-jawed and wore a monocle and moved through the office door like someone who had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago but retained the professional habit of paying attention. She looked at Harry first, then at McGonagall, then at the sorting hat, and said, "Tell me everything, starting from the beginning, leaving nothing out." McGonagall told her. Harry added things when she got facts slightly wrong, the wording the hat had used, the exact sequence of events, and Amelia Bones wrote everything down and asked sharp, precise questions that cut straight to the relevant points, and Harry thought she was probably the best person the ministry could have sent because she wasn't treating him like a problem to be managed, she was treating him like a witness. 38 fragments, she said, when McGonagall finished. Not one. Not two. 38. That's what it said, Harry confirmed. Bones looked at the hat. Is it capable of telling us anything else? Anything more specific about the nature of the fragments, or how they came to be there? I can answer questions, the hat said, and Bones didn't flinch at a hat talking, which impressed Harry considerably. But I should tell you that what I found is not ambiguous. I wasn't confused, and I wasn't projecting. The fragments are real, they are numerous, and they are, a pause, stable. They have been in him long enough to have settled. Long enough to have become part of the ecosystem of his magical core. And your assessment of their origin? Their magical signature is consistent with Voldemort's known core resonance. Consistent is too weak a word. They are identical. These are not copies. These are pieces of the actual soul. Bones wrote something down. Her face did not change. Her pen kept moving. And your assessment regarding Dumbledore's involvement? I am the oldest magical artifact in Britain, the hat said, and I have been in this castle for 1,000 years. I know what has happened here in that time. I know about the Philosopher's Stone. I know about the objects Dumbledore has collected and studied in his office. I know the shape of the research he has conducted, because research conducted in these walls leaves traces in the magic, like footprints. The hat paused. Albus Dumbledore has known about Horcruxes for decades. He has studied them with a depth of understanding that no other living wizard possesses. And he has known about the presence of dark soul fragments in Harry Potter since at least, another pause, this one heavier, since at least the night Harry was brought to his aunt's house. 11 years ago. The office was very quiet. Can you prove that? Bones asked. I can tell you what I know. Proof, in your legal sense, will require your unspeakables and their instruments. The hat's voice was dry. But I would be surprised if the instruments disagreed with me. Bones looked at McGonagall. McGonagall looked at Bones. Something passed between them, a shared weight, a shared recognition that the night had just become much longer than either of them had planned. I'll need to speak with Dumbledore, Bones said. He's in the school, McGonagall said. He hasn't left. Good. Bones capped her pen and stood. She looked at Harry again, and for the first time there was something in her expression that wasn't pure professional assessment, something that looked like I'm sorry this is happening to you, and I'm also going to make sure it's handled correctly, and Harry appreciated that she didn't say it aloud because he didn't need it said aloud, but he appreciated knowing it was there. Mr. Potter, she said, is there anything you want to ask me before I go speak to Dumbledore? Harry thought about it. What happens to me, he said. If the fragments are real. What happens? Bones was quiet for a moment. That will need to be determined by people with more expertise in this specific area than I have, she said. But I want to be clear, you are a victim, not a liability. Whatever decisions are made about next steps, you will be part of making them. No one should be doing things to you without your knowledge and agreement. Okay, Harry said. Does that satisfy you for now? Harry looked at her steadily. I'll let you know if it stops satisfying me. She looked at him for a moment longer, and something in her eyes was very close to approval. Then she turned to McGonagall, said, "I'll send 2 more Aurors within the hour," and left. McGonagall conjured fresh tea and set it in front of him. "Mr. Potter," she said, and then stopped. "You want to ask me something," Harry said. "I want to ask you several things." She folded her hands on her desk. "But I find that I'm struggling to find the appropriate order. You want to ask if I'm scared?" "Among other things." Harry looked down at the sorting hat in his lap. He felt its awareness, something patient and very old, coiled inside the fabric, paying attention. "I'm not scared," he said. "I think I probably should be." But when the hat was saying all of it, in the Great Hall, part of me felt like someone had finally just told me the truth about something, and I've been waiting for someone to do that for a long time. He turned the hat over in his hands. "I don't know what 38 fragments of a soul feels like from the inside. I've never felt what it's like to not have them. So I can't be scared of something that's just been the regular texture of my life." McGonagall looked at him, and he wondered what she was seeing, and he thought that whatever it was making her reconsider several things. "What I am," Harry said quietly, "is very interested in why. Why? Why 38? Not 1. Not 2. Not 10. He looked up at her. "Regular Horcruxes are objects. Difficult to make. Voldemort made a few, if the books I've read are anything to go by, and even those books are probably more honest than whatever I'll get told officially. But 38 inside one person?" He shook his head. "That's not an accident and it's not one choice. That's a project." McGonagall's expression was the expression of someone watching a child say something completely correct and completely devastating simultaneously. "Someone put a lot of effort into this," Harry said. "And I'd very much like to know what the project was for." Outside the office windows, the Scottish mountains were dark and enormous and absolutely indifferent to what was happening inside the castle, and somewhere in the school's depths Harry could hear, faintly, the sounds of the ministry beginning its work. He didn't feel afraid. He felt, for the first time in 11 years, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, not in Hogwarts, necessarily, not in any specific room, but standing at the beginning of a truth, looking down its length. It was very long. He would need to follow it carefully. He picked up the warm tea and sat back in the chair and waited for what came next. The second owl arrived from the ministry at midnight, and it wasn't a routine correspondence owl, it was a large, official-looking barred owl with a red seal on its letter that McGonagall opened with slightly tighter fingers than usual. She read it, and Harry watched her face, and something in her went very still. "What does it say?" he asked. She looked up. "Dumbledore has been placed under provisional detention." She said it evenly, the way someone says something they have been both dreading and, perhaps, for a long time feeling was necessary. "He will be held in the castle until a full examination of the evidence can be completed. An unspeakable team will arrive at first light." Harry nodded. "And what does he think about that?" "I imagine," McGonagall said carefully, "that Albus thinks this is a setback. Something to be managed. He has been in very difficult situations before and has always," she stopped herself. "He is a man accustomed to finding a way through." "So am I," Harry said. McGonagall looked at him and he looked back and neither of them looked away for a moment. "Yes," she said, and her voice was quieter than it had been all night. "I'm beginning to see that." The hat stirred in Harry's lap, just slightly, the way something stirs when it's deciding whether to sleep or stay awake. He put his hand on it without thinking about it, the way you'd put your hand on a dog to let it know you were there. "Get some rest, Mr. Potter," McGonagall said. "Tomorrow is going to be very long." "Tomorrow," Harry said, setting his tea down and standing, the hat tucked under his arm, "is going to be very interesting." He walked to the door, and then paused, and turned back. "Professor McGonagall," he said. "Yes. Thank you for not trying to make me feel better." She looked at him. Outside, the castle was full of the sounds of a night that had broken open into something completely new. Inside this office it was quiet and warm, and two people had just begun, without saying it, to trust each other. "Thank you," McGonagall said, "for not needing me to." Harry nodded, and went to find the provisional dormitory, and lay in a strange bed in a strange castle with 38 fragments of a dead dark wizard humming quietly inside him like a second heartbeat, and he stared at the ceiling and he thought about all the things no one had told him, and he thought about all the questions he was going to ask, and he did not feel afraid, not even a little, and that was perhaps the most significant thing of all. The hat sat on the bedpost beside him. "Are you going to explain any more of this tonight?" Harry asked it, quietly, so as not to wake the other boys who had been assigned to this room. "No," the hat said. "You need to sleep. I could sleep better if I understood more. You'll understand more tomorrow. Sleep first. You're going to need to be sharp." Harry considered arguing. Then he thought that the hat was probably right, and that an argument with a 1,000-year-old artifact was probably not the most efficient use of his time. "Fine," he said. "Good," said the hat. Harry closed his eyes. Around him the castle settled and breathed, ancient and enormous, and somewhere in its depths the machinery of a very old deception was beginning, very slowly, to come apart. Chapter 2, The Architecture of Silence. The Unspeakables arrived at dawn. Harry heard them before he saw them, a particular quality of silence moving through the castle, the kind that precedes people who have been trained not to make noise. He was already awake, had been awake for an hour, sitting cross-legged on his bed with the hat in his lap while the other boys in the dormitory slept the deep, uncomplicated sleep of people whose lives had not just been restructured by a talking hat. He dressed quickly and went downstairs. The common room was empty except for the dying fire and a tabby cat sitting on the back of an armchair near the door. The cat looked at him with the particular attention of something that was more than it appeared, and Harry looked back and said, "Good morning, Professor McGonagall," because she'd transformed in the hallway on his way to the dormitory last night and he'd seen the markings around her eyes and filed it away. The cat blinked once, slowly, and then McGonagall was sitting in the armchair in her robes with her hair already pinned, looking like she'd never been a cat at all. "How did you know?" she asked. "The markings," he said. "Around your eyes. Same pattern." He paused. "Also you were watching the door at 4 in the morning, which seems like something a cat would do but only if the cat had a reason." She studied him with an expression that was becoming familiar, the one that recalibrated slightly every time he said something. "The Unspeakables are in the castle," she said. "They need to examine you this morning." "I wanted to," she paused, selecting words with care, "make sure you were informed before they arrived at your door." "I appreciate that," Harry said. He sat down on the hearth rug, which seemed more comfortable than any of the chairs, and the fire crackled back to life without anyone touching it, which he noticed but didn't comment on. "What will they do?" "The examination. They'll use diagnostic instruments. Very old magic, developed to detect soul fragmentation, among other things." She folded her hands. "It won't be painful. I've been assured of that." "You asked specifically?" "Yes." Harry nodded. "Who's running the examination? Who's in charge of it?" "Senior Unspeakable Croaker. She seemed to be deciding how to characterize him, deeply competent and almost entirely without social skills, but you can trust him to be accurate." "I don't need him to have social skills," Harry said. "I need him to be accurate." The fire popped. Outside, the sky through the common room's windows was doing the complicated transition from pre-dawn gray to something that wanted to be blue, and Harry watched it and thought about what being accurate meant when what you were being accurate about was 38 pieces of someone else's soul. "Professor," he said. How does someone make a Horcrux?" "The basics. Not the details, I know you won't give me the details, but the concept." McGonagall was quiet for a moment. He'd noticed she did that, took the time to actually think about whether to answer, rather than reflexively refusing. He liked that about her. Murder, she said. You take a life. The act of it tears something in your own soul. A Horcrux is a deliberate exploitation of that tear. You rip a piece of your own soul away and anchor it to an object. Or, in extraordinarily dark magic, to a living vessel. She paused. It's not something that should be physically possible to do to someone else. It requires the victims, she stopped. What? It requires specific conditions. Conditions I don't fully understand. Conditions that, frankly, no one should fully understand. She looked at him directly. I don't know how it was done to you, Harry. I want to be honest about that. I don't know if anyone does, except possibly Albus. Who isn't going to tell me? Who is currently not in a position to tell anyone anything they don't want to hear. Harry was quiet for a moment, listening to the castle wake up, somewhere above them, dormitory doors, footsteps, the muffled sounds of other people's ordinary mornings. The hat said they've settled, he said. The fragments. That they're stable. Part of what did it say, my magical core's ecosystem. Yes. So they're not killing me. They're not eating me, or whatever dark magic does when it's inside a person. Apparently not. Then they've become part of how I work magically. McGonagall said nothing, which was itself an answer. I want to understand what that means, Harry said. Not because I'm frightened. Because it's mine. Whatever is in me is mine now, whether or not it was supposed to be, and I want to understand what I'm working with. The tabby cat was gone. McGonagall in her chair looked at him, and the fire between them threw light across her face, and she said, quietly, yes. I believe you should. The unspeakables were waiting in the hospital wing, which Madame Pomfrey had half evacuated and half converted into something that looked like a cross between a laboratory and an observatory. There were 3 of them, in pale grey robes without identifiers, and the one in the middle, Croaker, presumably, was a small, broad man with close-cropped white hair and eyes that moved over everything with the specific quality of something that measured rather than merely looked. He looked at Harry and said, immediately, sit on the bed. Don't touch anything. This will take 40 minutes and I'll explain what I'm doing as I do it. All right, Harry said, and sat. Croaker proved to be exactly what McGonagall had said, entirely accurate, entirely without interest in managing Harry's emotions, which Harry found deeply refreshing after a lifetime of adults who softened everything until it was a different shape. He explained each instrument as he deployed it, the resonance prism, which looked like a chandelier made of crystal and threw light in patterns that meant things to Croaker the way text meant things to a reader, the soul depth compass, which looked like a navigational instrument and, Croaker explained without inflection, was designed in 1347 to deal with a specific outbreak of Horcrux-related activity in Bulgaria, and what he called simply the counter, which was a small brass device that ticked. What does the counter do? Harry asked. Counts, Croaker said. What does it count? Discrete magical entities occupying a single magical core. Normally the result is 1. Occasionally 2, in very rare cases of partial soul merging due to trauma. More than that has never been. He paused, and something moved across his face that might have been the unspeakable equivalent of disbelief, documented. In a living subject. The counter ticked. Harry watched it. Croaker watched it. The 2 other unspeakables, who had not been introduced and had not spoken, watched it. The counter reached 38 and stopped. Croaker stared at it for 4 full seconds. Then he reached into his robes, produced a notebook, and began writing in a hand so small it was barely visible. Confirm, he said to the counter, quietly, the way you'd say it to a witness you needed to hear again in court. The counter ticked to 38 again. And their nature? Harry asked. Croaker looked at him. It was the look of someone recalibrating what a child was. Dark soul fragments. Voldemort's signature. The hat's finding was accurate. He kept writing. The fragments are, he tilted the notebook, extraordinarily well integrated. More integrated than they should be. More integrated than I would have thought possible without the host's magical core having actively. He stopped writing. Actively what? Harry said. Croaker looked at him again, and now his expression was something Harry would come to recognize over the next several days as Croaker's version of fascination, which looked on anyone else like mild constipation but on him meant he was encountering something genuinely new. Your magical core has not been suppressed by the fragments, Croaker said. Which is what should happen. Foreign soul magic in a living host suppresses native magical development. Creates a ceiling. But your core has, he made a gesture that seemed to indicate he was selecting the least inadequate word available, grown around them. Incorporated them into its own architecture. The fragments are not suppressing your magic. They are, at least partly, feeding it. The hospital wing was very quiet. How strong is his core? McGonagall asked from the doorway, and Harry had not heard her come in, but he turned and she was there, and her expression was the same controlled complicated thing it had been all morning, but underneath it was something taut. Croaker wrote something else. That's not a simple question to answer. Approximate it. Croaker looked at the resonance prism, which was throwing light in patterns that had started to go beyond the crystal and paint themselves on the walls. He looked at the counter, still sitting on 38. He looked at Harry. Comparable to an adult wizard of significant natural talent, he said. Currently. With full development, he shook his head, and it was the head shake of someone who doesn't have a number large enough. We're in unmapped territory. Harry looked at his own hands. They looked ordinary. A little bony, the knuckle of his right index finger slightly scarred from a door hinge in the Desley's kitchen. Completely ordinary hands. Good, he said. Croaker raised an eyebrow. I was 11 years in that house, Harry said simply. It's nice to know something came of it. There was a small sound from McGonagall's direction that Harry chose not to examine too closely. Croaker finished his examination, wrote 16 more pages of notes that Harry suspected contained enough raw academic discovery to occupy the Department of Mysteries for a decade, and then looked at Harry with a directness that Harry appreciated. You have questions, Croaker said. It wasn't a question. Can they be removed? Harry asked. Theoretically. All Horcruxes can be destroyed. But destruction of a fragment embedded in a living host is, Croaker paused. It's not a simple extraction. The fragment and the host's magic have grown together. Removing one would require, removing some of me too, Harry said. In a manner of speaking. The process is not well documented. It has not been attempted in a living subject. Croaker held his pen. I want to be accurate with you rather than reassuring, so I will say, I don't know exactly what the removal process would involve or what it would cost you. And if they stay? Also unmapped territory. Croaker's pen tapped his notebook. You are not dying. You are not in immediate danger. Your core is stable. But the long-term effects of hosting 38 soul fragments while living and developing, there is no literature. So I'm the literature, Harry said. You are, Croaker said, with something that was almost appreciation for the precision. Yes. Right. Harry hopped off the bed. One more question. Yes. Can I feel them? Intentionally, I mean. The fragments. Can I reach them? Croaker opened his mouth and closed it, and Harry thought it was possibly the first time the man had been without an immediate answer. We don't know, he said finally. We've never had anyone to ask. Harry nodded and thanked him and went to find the hat. It was still in the Gryffindor dormitory where he'd left it, perched on the bedpost in a room now empty of its other occupants. Morning light fell through the windows and dust moved in it, slow and golden, and the hat watched him come in with the patience of something that has been waiting and knew it would be waited on in return. He sat on the bed. Croaker says my core has grown around the fragments. That they're feeding it. Yes, the hat said. You knew that. I suspected it. When I was inside your mind, I could feel, it's difficult to describe in language designed for simpler things. Imagine a tree growing through a fence. The fence is still there, the fence is still itself, but the tree has incorporated the iron into its bark. Both things are true simultaneously. The tree is stronger for it, though the strength has an unusual shape. Harry thought about this. Can I feel them? Deliberately. The hat was quiet for a moment. What you're asking, it said finally, is whether you can access the fragments as a resource. Yes. You already do. You have been, without knowing it, for years. The reason you understand things about dark magic that you've never been taught, the reason certain spells feel intuitive when they shouldn't, the reason you sometimes know when something is wrong before you can explain why, those are not accidents of your personality, Harry. Those are the fragments being useful. Harry sat with that. Outside the window, Hogwarts grounds spread out enormous and misty, the lake silver in the morning light, the forbidden forest dark at its edges. A completely impossible and completely real place where apparently everything he'd ever been told about himself was either a lie or an omission. Dumbledore knew all of this, Harry said. Not a question. Yes. The whole time. Since I was a baby. I believe since before you were a baby, the hat said. I believe the conditions that allowed what happened to you to happen were arranged. In advance. A pause. I am not able to tell you the full shape of what was planned. But I can tell you that a great deal of very careful thought went into your situation. You were not a mistake. You were a design. Harry's hands were very still in his lap. A design for what? He asked, and his voice came out level, which he was glad about. That, the hat said, is what the trial will need to answer. He found Ron in the Great Hall, which was emptier than it should have been for a school morning. Students were clustered in groups, voices low, and the normal noise of breakfast felt muted and careful, like a room full of people who know something large is coming and don't quite know which direction to face. The Morning Post owls came and went with frantic frequency, letters traveling back and forth between the school and wizarding households across Britain, and every time an owl came in with a newspaper the nearest students fell on it immediately. Ron was sitting at the end of the Gryffindor table, conspicuously alone in a way that suggested the aloneness was chosen, with a piece of toast he wasn't eating in one hand and an expression of someone working very hard through something difficult. Harry sat down across from him. Ron looked up. There was a moment where Harry could see him trying to decide what to do with his face, and then something in Ron seemed to decide that pretending things were normal was not actually possible, and his expression settled into something honest and slightly helpless. So, Ron said. So, Harry agreed. 38. Apparently. Ron put down the toast. I've been trying to figure out what to say since last night. I've been up since 5. I've had 3 cups of tea and I've written and thrown away about 6 different things I was going to say to you and none of them, he made a gesture, none of them were good enough. You don't have to say anything particularly good, Harry said. You can just say what you actually think. Ron looked at him. He had a very honest face, Harry had noticed on the train, everything showed up on it immediately, which was probably inconvenient for him but was useful for Harry, who'd spent his life trying to read adults who worked very hard to give nothing away. What I actually think, Ron said, is that it's bloody awful what's been done to you and I'm furious about it and also I don't totally understand it and also I want to still be your friend if that's something you want. Because last night Percy was going on about how we don't know what 38 fragments of you-know-whose soul does to a person and whether it's safe and I told him that you sat in McGonagall's office for 3 hours asking intelligent questions while the world fell apart and that seemed fine to me. Harry looked at him. Ron looked back, slightly flushed, like someone who'd said too much and wasn't sure if it was the right amount. Yes, Harry said. Yes what? Yes I want to still be your friend. Ron exhaled like he'd been holding it. Right. Good. Okay. He picked up the toast and took a bite, apparently to have something to do. So what happens now? Ministry examination. Trial at some point. A lot of people wanting to decide things about me. Harry poured himself some pumpkin juice, which he decided he preferred to anything the Dursleys had ever served and intended to drink as much of as possible. And I'm going to need to learn magic. Ron blinked. Sorry. I'm in this school, aren't I? Might as well learn what it's for. Harry looked around the hall. Where's Hermione Granger? Ron pointed without thinking. End of the Ravenclaw. No, wait, she's Gryffindor, she was sorted before. He turned, there, the one reading the Prophet. Hermione was 3 seats down on the Gryffindor side, the Daily Prophet spread in front of her and a bowl of porridge going cold beside it, reading with the focused intensity of someone who treated information as something to be consumed rapidly before it could escape. Harry picked up his pumpkin juice and moved down the table and sat beside her. She looked up. She had, Harry noticed, been crying at some point in the night, not recently, but the remnants were there. She also looked like she'd made a decision about something, the way people look after they've had an internal argument and one side has won. I've been reading everything I can find, she said, without preamble, which Harry appreciated enormously. The Prophet has about 4 paragraphs of accurate information and 8 paragraphs of speculation. I've cross-referenced with what I remember from Magic Most Evil, which mentions Horcruxes in the chapter it doesn't actually let you read, and the theory of magical resonance, which has a section on soul magic that's clearly been Baudelarized but you can still work out the original from context if you're careful. She paused for breath. And I have a lot of questions. Ask them, Harry said. She blinked. Clearly she'd been expecting more resistance. Then she straightened her spine and said, how are you feeling? Specifically. Not emotionally, although that too, if you want, but magically. Are you more aware of things? Does magic feel different to you than it should for someone who's never had any formal training? Harry thought about the moments throughout his childhood when impossible things had happened, the hair regrowing overnight, winding up on the school roof, the glass disappearing at the zoo. He'd always assumed those were accidents. He thought about them now differently. Everything's always felt natural to me, he said. The magic. I didn't understand what it was, but when things happened they didn't feel wrong. They felt obvious. Like the most direct solution. Hermione was nodding, writing something in a notebook she'd produced from nowhere. That's consistent with the integration Croker described. I heard McGonagall telling Flitwick this morning in the corridor, I wasn't eavesdropping, I just have good hearing. She didn't look remotely apologetic about any of this. If the fragments have become part of your magical architecture rather than a foreign body, then your magical instincts would be shaped by all of it, not just the native core. That's what the hat said, Harry told her. Hermione looked at the hat, which Harry had brought to breakfast and set on the table beside him. Oh, she said, and something in her voice went slightly odd, in the way of someone encountering a primary source. Could I ask you something? You may, the hat said. Hermione looked like Christmas had come early. In your examination of Harry's core, did you find any evidence of deliberate suppression? Any external magical structure that had been placed on him to limit his access to his own abilities? The great hall chatter continued around them, and Ron had come to sit on Harry's other side and was listening with a focused attention that Harry suspected was his natural mode when something actually mattered. Yes, the hat said. Harry turned to look at it. There are 3 distinct suppression structures on your magical core, the hat said, addressing Harry directly. I noticed them last night but in the interest of the more immediately urgent information, I did not mention them. They are old. They were placed when you were very young, perhaps even in infancy. They appear to be Dumbledore's work. The hall was noisy around them. The noise felt very far away. What do they do? Harry asked. The first limits the speed at which your magical core signals reach conscious awareness. It means that while your instincts function, as you've demonstrated, your conscious access to deliberate magic is delayed. You should be able to perform intentional spell work much more quickly and powerfully than an untrained 11-year-old. The suppressor ensures that you present as normal. The hat paused. The second suppressor affects your ability to sense other magical signatures. You should, with your core configuration, be able to feel the magical presence of others the way a strong muggle can feel warmth from a fire across a room. The suppressor reduces this to near zero. And the third? Hermione asked, because she had already entirely adopted Harry's problem as a problem worth solving, which was something Harry would appreciate more over time than he could express now. The third, the hat said, prevents Harry from sensing the fragments directly. Without it, he would have been able to feel them all his life. To understand them. Potentially to work with them. Ron said, quietly, someone didn't want him to know what he was. No, the hat agreed. Someone wanted him to remain ignorant, limited, and unaware of his own nature until the precise moment it became useful. The hat's voice was even, but there was something underneath it that had the temperature of very old anger. Someone wanted a weapon that did not know it was a weapon. Harry was looking at the table. He was aware of Hermione on one side, very still, and Ron on the other, and the hat in front of him, and the hundreds of students in the hall all talking about him without knowing they were 2 meters away from the subject of their conversation. Can you remove the suppressors? Harry asked. I don't have hands, the hat said. You know what I mean. I can tell you their structure. Enough for a sufficiently skilled witch or wizard to dismantle them. The hat paused. Croaker could do it. Or Professor Flitwick, his understanding of charm work is exceptional enough to handle the architecture. Harry looked up. McGonagall was at the high table, talking in a low voice with Flitwick, and she glanced down the hall at him and he met her eyes and she gave him a slight nod, the kind that means I am still paying attention and you are not alone. He thought about what had been taken from him. Not dramatically, he wasn't a person given to dramatic internal spiraling, which was probably one of the few useful things 11 years of being unwanted had actually given him, but clearly. 11 years in a cupboard that was also, in a manner of speaking, his own head. Ceilings put in place by someone who decided that Harry Potter needed to stay small until it was time for him to be used. He felt something then. Not anger exactly. Cleaner than anger. More structural. Like a foundation being laid. I'd like the suppressors removed, he said. As soon as possible. Today. I'll speak to Flitwick, McGonagall said, from directly behind him, which meant she'd covered the distance from the high table very quickly. Harry turned. She was standing there with her hands clasped in front of her and an expression that said she had heard the whole conversation and had been making decisions. You heard the hat say these were placed by Dumbledore, Harry said. Yes. And you still want to remove them. They are your magic, Mr. Potter. They were taken from you. She said it very simply, the way someone states a fact that has a clear consequence. I think I have been, she paused, and Harry watched the pause cost her something. I think there are things I should have questioned earlier. I did not question them because I trusted the person who would have had to answer the questions. Her jaw set. I will not make that error again. Ron was looking at McGonagall with an expression Harry couldn't quite read. Later he would explain it to Harry as, she's one of the people in our world who you actually want to be when they're being good. At this moment his face was working through what it meant for someone you trusted to reveal they'd had reasons not to be trusted. Hermione had filled 2 pages of notes. There's something else, Harry said to McGonagall. Yes. If the suppressors are Dumbledore's, removing them will be evidence. Evidence of what he put in place deliberately. You should make sure Croaker or someone appropriate documents them before they're removed. McGonagall looked at him. I want him to answer for what he did, Harry said. Not just be provisionally detained. I want there to be a proper accounting, in front of people who have to put it in writing, and I want to be there for it. He met her eyes. I'm not going to be a case file, Professor. I'm going to be a person in the room. McGonagall held his gaze for a long moment, and he watched something in her go from the reflex of he is a child and I should manage this carefully to something more like yes, and why would I want anything different? I'll make the arrangements, she said. The document of Dumbledore's magical suppressors was completed by 10 o'clock. Croker handled it with the same flat efficiency he brought to everything, cataloging each one with instruments that mapped their architecture onto parchment in spiraling diagrams of light, and the evidence went into a sealed ministry container that would be delivered to Bones before noon. Flitwick removed them at 10:30, in McGonagall's office, with Harry sitting in the chair and McGonagall standing by the window and the hat on the desk watching. The process, Flitwick explained in his characteristic rapid but meticulous way, was like unpicking stitches. You had to find the thread, follow it back to the source, remove it without tearing what it was sewn into. "This is very fine work," Flitwick said, about the suppressors, with the admiration of a craftsman who can appreciate skill even in service of something he finds reprehensible. "Extraordinarily careful. Almost invisible if you don't know what to look for." He paused, one tracing a delicate path around Harry's left temple. "The person who made these understood magical architecture at a level very few living wizards do." "Can you remove them?" Harry asked. "Of course I can," Flitwick said, slightly affronted. "Ready? This won't hurt, but you may feel odd." "Ready." The first suppressor came away and it was like a window opening in a room that had been shut for years. Harry drew a breath and the air tasted different, not literally, but the world had more texture, more information in it, the castle around him suddenly tangible in a way it hadn't been, stone and magic and the signatures of hundreds of people like warmth from many different fires. "Oh," he said. Flitwick said, working on the second. The second suppressor removed itself like a knot untying, and suddenly Harry could feel things, others, the complex electromagnetic signatures of people nearby. McGonagall was by the window and she felt like authority and contained worry and a bedrock of genuine care that she expressed through precision rather than warmth. Flitwick was like clockwork, intricate and certain. The hat on the desk was something so old it barely had the shape of a person anymore, more like landscape. And underneath all of it, in his own chest, were the 38 fragments, and they were not quiet. Not loud. Like 38 instruments playing in the same key, a chord rather than individual notes, and underneath that chord was his own magic, and together they made something that had no name he'd encountered yet. The third suppressor came free. Harry sat very still for a moment. "Harry?" McGonagall said. "I'm fine," he said. "And then, I can feel all of them." "The fragments?" "Yes." He opened his eyes and looked at his hands. The morning light came through the window and fell across them and they looked ordinary and he thought, no they don't, actually. Not anymore. "They're not dark," he said. "I thought they'd feel dark. Threatening. But they don't." "What do they feel like?" the hat asked from the desk. Harry thought about it for a moment. "They feel like memories," he said. "Lots of very old memories, from someone who was very determined. And very afraid." McGonagall and Flitwick exchanged a look over his head. "Voldemort," Flitwick said quietly, "was afraid." "Of dying," Harry said. "That's what I can feel." This enormous desperate, he shook his head. He was terrified of ceasing to exist. All of this, all 38 pieces of him inside me, they all carry that same thing. The same note. Terror of ending. He paused. It makes him seem more, I was going to say human, but I think the word is sad. The office was quiet. "I feel sorry for him," Harry said, and he sounded almost surprised by it. Which seems strange, given that he apparently murdered my parents and got various pieces of himself put inside me. But there it is. Complicated feelings, Flitwick said carefully, about complicated things are usually the accurate response. Yes, Harry agreed, and stood, and tested the feeling of himself standing, the floor solid under his feet and the castle alive around him and the cord of himself and the fragments rich and deep in his chest. Right. I need to do something. What? McGonagall asked. Harry looked at her. I need to talk to Dumbledore. She started to object, he could see it coming, the professional reflex to protect, to manage, to keep a child away from the sharp edges. "Professor," he said. "I am the person he did this to. I am not a bystander to this situation. I'm not going to walk into whatever trial or investigation or legal proceeding comes next having never heard him say a single word about what he did and why." He met her eyes. "I need to hear him explain it. In his own words. Before anyone else shapes the story." McGonagall looked at him for a long time. "I'm coming with you," she said. Dumbledore was in his office, which had not been locked, only warded to prevent his departure from the castle. It was, Harry thought, a strange kind of arrest, the most powerful man in Wizarding Britain confined to the most impressive room in the most powerful magical institution in the country, surrounded by his own things. It felt less like justice and more like a very polite disagreement. The office was everything you'd expect of someone who'd had decades to accumulate the objects that expressed themselves, tall, circular, full of silver instruments that moved and measured things, full of portraits of previous headmasters and headmistresses that were watching with avid interest but staying, for now, quiet. Fawkes the Phoenix sat on his perch and watched Harry come in with eyes the color of old fire and did not move. Dumbledore was sitting behind his desk. He looked, at first glance, exactly the same as he had in the Great Hall, long silver beard, half-moon spectacles, the full weight of his age worn lightly. But Harry, with his suppressors gone, could feel him now the way he could feel McGonagall and Flitwick, and what Dumbledore felt like was, a fortress. Walls within walls. Architecture of self so dense and layered that it was impossible to tell where the person ended and the persona began. But underneath everything, underneath all the layers, the same thing Harry had felt in the fragments. Terror. Different in shape, not about dying exactly but about something adjacent. About losing. About being wrong. About being wrong and not being able to fix it. "Harry," Dumbledore said, warmly. "Don't do that," Harry said. Dumbledore paused. "Don't use my first name like we have a relationship." "We don't have a relationship." Harry sat in a chair across the desk without being invited. McGonagall stood behind him. "I want you to explain to me what you did and why. I'm not asking if it was the right thing. I'm not asking for an apology. I just want the explanation. Plainly." Dumbledore looked at him over the half-moon glasses with those blue eyes that had probably moved 100 people to trust him, and Harry looked back with 38 fragments of a dead dark wizard in his chest and 3 fewer suppressors than he'd started the morning with, and he waited. "There is a prophecy," Dumbledore said. "I assumed there was a prophecy." Something shifted in Dumbledore's face, the faintest trace of being surprised, which he was apparently not accustomed to. "Then you understand that some decisions—" "No," Harry said. "I don't understand that yet. You're going to have to actually explain, not gesture at a large concept and expect me to fill in the blanks in your favor." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, less the warm headmaster and more something that had to be honest because the alternative was too costly. "Voldemort created Horcruxes," he said. "More than anyone knew. When he attempted to kill you as an infant, when the curse rebounded, some of what he was came apart. Some of it ended up in me," Harry said. "Yes. But not 38. He looked at Harry steadily. "When I first examined you, 11 years ago, there were 7 fragments. A terrible number, and a dangerous one, but 7. Manageable, in the context of the larger problem." His fingers folded together. "What the hat found last night, 38, is not what I knew." Harry was very still. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Dumbledore said, very quietly, "that I am not the only one who has been doing things to you." He met Harry's eyes. "And that there are one or more people who have been adding to what was inside you, for 11 years, without my knowledge." The room was very silent. McGonagall, behind Harry, said, "Albus." "I am telling the truth," Dumbledore said, and for the first time all morning, all night, really, he sounded like something other than controlled, something other than a fortress. He sounded like a man who has just discovered that his very careful equation has been running on wrong numbers. I have not always been right, Minerva. I have not always been good. But in this specific thing I am telling you the truth, I knew about 7 fragments. I have never heard of 38, and if I had, I would. He stopped. You would what? Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. I would have made different choices, he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been the closest thing to genuine contrition his architecture was capable of producing. Many different choices. Harry sat with that for a moment. Who else, he said. Who else knew about me? Who else has access? That, Dumbledore said, is what I have been trying to determine since 2 in the morning. He looked at Harry with an expression that had something unexpected in it, something that looked, startlingly, like a request. Harry. I am not asking you to trust me. I don't have the right to ask that. But I am asking you to consider that there may be a third party in this situation, one with their own agenda, and that finding them may be more important than deciding the full extent of my culpability right now. It can be both, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore agreed. I suppose it can. Harry stood. Dumbledore looked older than he had when Harry had come in, which Harry hadn't thought was possible. I'll be at the Wizengamot session, Harry said. Whenever it happens. And you should know, he paused at the door, I'm not going to be managed through that process. By you, by the ministry, by anyone. I'm the one it happened to and I'll be saying what I actually think. He left without waiting for an answer. In the corridor outside, walking back toward the staircases with McGonagall at his side, he thought about what Dumbledore had said. 7 fragments, he'd known about. 38 was a different number. A different scale of something. And someone, in the years Harry had been growing up in a cupboard under the stairs, had been quietly, carefully adding to what he carried. Do you believe him? McGonagall asked, as they reached the staircase. Harry thought about the fortress feeling of Dumbledore's presence. The layers. The terror underneath the layers. I believe he's telling the partial truth, he said. Which in some ways is more alarming than a complete lie. Why? Because it means there's someone worse, Harry said. He started up the stairs, and the castle moved around him, alive and full of secrets and full of people all asking the wrong questions, and in his chest 38 old voices hummed their quiet, frightened chord, and he thought, I'm going to find out everything. Not because someone told him to. Because he had decided. Chapter 3, A Parliament of Wolves. The owl arrived at breakfast on Thursday. It was enormous, a ministry bird, the official kind with red leg bands that meant the letter it carried had been sealed by someone with Wizengamot authority. It dropped the letter directly in front of Harry, bypassing the pile of other correspondence that had been accumulating at his seat since Tuesday, letters from strangers, from reporters, from what appeared to be several different wizarding legal firms, and one very thick envelope from someone who had addressed it to the boy with the dark fragments which Harry had not opened on the grounds that whoever sent it had not bothered to learn his name. He picked up the ministry letter and broke the seal. Ron leaned across his toast. What does it say? Wizengamot emergency session, Harry said. Tomorrow. 10 o'clock. He read further. I'm summoned as primary witness. He set the letter down and poured himself pumpkin juice. Also Dumbledore is formally charged, it looks like. 5 counts of magical negligence, 2 of deliberate concealment, and, he turned the parchment over, 1 count of conspiracy to endanger a minor, which I think is the serious one. Hermione had materialized at his elbow, having crossed from her seat with her own copy of the Prophet, which had Potter bombshell, ministry moves against Dumbledore in letters that took up most of the front page. Are you ready for this? She asked. I need to understand the Wizengamot first, Harry said. How it works. Who's on it? Who wants what? Hermione sat down and opened her notebook, which now had a dedicated section for exactly this. 200 members, she said, roughly. Senior members are appointed, junior members are hereditary or ministry nominated. The chief warlock is supposed to be neutral but, she paused, Dumbledore is the chief warlock. Harry looked up. He's presiding over his own trial. He'll be recused, obviously. Temporarily replaced. She turned pages. The acting chief warlock for the session will be Tiberius Ogden, who is, more page-turning, described in Wizarding Britain's political landscape as reliably neutral but temperamentally conservative, which I think means he respects process but doesn't like surprises. He'll be getting a surprise, Ron said. I'll need to know who the hostile members are, Harry said. Not the ones hostile to Dumbledore, the ones hostile to me. The ones who'll want to turn this into something about whether I'm dangerous. Hermione and Ron both looked at him. 38 Horcrux fragments, Harry said patiently. Somebody in that room will be more worried about what I am than about what was done to me. I want to know who before I walk in. Hermione wrote something. I'll research it today. Ron, your dad works at the ministry, he'll know the names, Ron said, without particular enthusiasm. Yeah. I'll write him. Harry looked at him. Ron's face was doing something complicated, the face of someone whose loyalties were being tested in a direction they hadn't expected. You don't have to, Harry started. I know I don't have to, Ron said, firmly, and picked up his quill. Pass the marmalade. Harry passed the marmalade. The rest of Thursday moved fast and purposeful, which Harry preferred to moving slow and anxious. Hermione produced, by lunch, a 12-page summary of current Wisingamot membership with color-coded annotations, green for likely sympathetic, red for likely hostile, yellow for uncertain. She explained it to Harry over sandwiches in the library with the hat on the table between them, occasionally consulting it on points of magical law that fell outside her research materials. The hostile column was longer than the sympathetic one but not, Harry noticed, for uniform reasons. Some members objected to the treatment of a child on principle but were simultaneously terrified of what the child might be. Some had old ties to Voldemort, or to the ideology, and saw in Harry's revelation an opportunity to destabilize the existing order. Some were simply Dumbledore loyalists who believed the trial was a political attack. Malfoy, Hermione said, tapping a name. Lucius Malfoy. He's a senior Wisingamot member. He was a Death Eater, claimed he was under the Imperius curse, never actually proven either way, and he has money and influence and he will absolutely try to make this about you rather than Dumbledore if he gets the opening. What would he want? Harry asked. Specifically. What's his play? Hermione thought. He'd want you classified as a dark artifact. A vessel of dark magic rather than a victim of it. If the Wisingamot declares you a dark artifact, technically I stop being a person with rights and become a thing the ministry manages, Harry said. Yes. He won't get that, Harry said, not particularly agitated about it, the way someone says that weather isn't coming this direction while looking at a clear sky. He might try, Hermione said. He can try, Harry said. What else? Arthur Weasley's reply to Ron's letter arrived by mid-afternoon, and Arthur, whatever his feelings about Dumbledore, was clearly a man who put his son's requests above his institutional discomfort. The letter was detailed and precise, names, positions, likely voting patterns, and a note at the bottom in slightly smaller writing that said, "Tell Harry to be himself." The Wisingamot hasn't dealt with anyone like him before. That's an advantage. Ron read this last part aloud and Harry thought about it and decided that Arthur Weasley was probably a good person to know. They worked until dinner. After dinner Harry went back to the library alone, because he needed to think without being helpful to anyone, which was different from being alone because you had no one, it was alone by choice, which was a luxury he'd never had in the Dursleys' house and which felt, every time he used it, like something quietly remarkable. He read everything Madame Pants had on wizarding law that was accessible to a first year, which wasn't much, and then he sat very still for a while and thought about what Dumbledore had said about a third party. About someone adding fragments for 11 years. He let himself feel the fragments. He'd been doing this in small increments since Flitwick removed the suppressors, a careful exploration, the way you test a door you're not sure is solid. They weren't people. They weren't voices with opinions. They were more like preserved states. Moments of being from someone who no longer existed in his original form. Terror, yes, the deep-water terror of non-existence. But also other things, fierce intelligence, genuine love for the art of magic divorced from any ethical use of it, a cold strategic clarity that Harry found he could pick up and put down like a tool. He had been careful not to think too loudly about the strategic clarity. He thought about it now. Someone had added 31 fragments to the original 7 over 11 years. That was not an act of opportunity, that was a program. It required access to Harry, repeated access, which meant either someone at the Dursleys' house or someone who could reach him remotely or someone who'd been present at key moments in his life without Harry knowing who they were. It required knowledge of Horcrux creation that was, as far as anyone seemed to know, possessed by approximately 2 people in the world, Dumbledore and whoever had been Voldemort's closest confidant. It required, Harry thought, someone who wanted Harry to be something specific. Someone with a plan that needed Harry to be more than Dumbledore's version, needed him to be a weapon of a different, larger kind. He took out a piece of parchment and wrote 3 questions. Who knew about the original 7 fragments besides Dumbledore? Who had access to me, age 0 to 11, with sufficient magical skill to add to what was already there? What would 38 fragments do differently from 7, if used as intended? He looked at the questions for a while. Then he folded the parchment and put it in his pocket and went to bed. He slept well. He'd found that he slept better since the suppressors came off, deeper, more completely, as though his mind had been running at partial capacity for years and was now allowed to actually rest. He was ready at 8 the next morning. The ministry atrium was exactly what you'd expect from a magical government, enormous, gold-decorated, full of moving fireplaces disgorging people in robes who moved with the purposeful urgency of people who have meetings to attend. Harry arrived by ministry escort with McGonagall, Croaker, and Amelia Bones, who had collected them from the Hogwarts gates in a ministry carriage that moved at a speed the roads couldn't strictly account for. People stared. Harry was used to staring by now, had been used to it since Tuesday, really, when the entire school had spent every mealtime oriented toward him. But ministry staring had a different quality. School staring was curiosity and some fear and a lot of 14-year-olds trying to figure out if he was impressive or just strange. Ministry staring was assessment. He was a political object in this building and everyone who looked at him was already calculating. He looked back at all of them, steady and unhurried, which seemed to be the thing that unsettled people the most. They were taken to a waiting room adjacent to the main courtroom, a small, wood-paneled space with chairs that were clearly meant to communicate the ministry's institutional gravitas through discomfort. Harry sat. McGonagall sat. Bones reviewed parchments. Croaker stood by the door looking like he had better places to be and was choosing this one by force of professional duty. When they call me in, Harry said to Bones, what's the format? You'll give your account. The panel may ask questions. Certain members will attempt to ask questions that are actually arguments, you'll recognize them because they'll be framed as questions but built to lead you toward a specific answer. She looked at him over her papers. You don't have to follow where they lead. I know, Harry said. I'm saying you have the right, procedurally, to redirect. You can answer the question you were actually asked rather than the one hidden inside it. I know how to do that, Harry said. Bones looked at him. I've been doing it my whole life, he said. Every time Aunt Petunia asked me something that was actually about whether I was going to be a problem. Bones held his gaze for a moment. Good, she said. McGonagall, who had said nothing for several minutes, said very quietly, Harry. However this goes today, I want you to know that there are people in that room on your side. How many? Harry asked. She paused. Enough, she said. That's not a number. No, she agreed, it isn't. She met his eyes. Enough to prevent the worst outcomes. Not necessarily enough to guarantee the best ones. You'll need to do some of that work yourself. Harry nodded. I'm ready to do the work. The door opened and a ministry official whose name he didn't catch said, "The Wizengamot is ready for Mr. Potter." The courtroom was underground. Harry hadn't expected that. He'd imagined something more overtly imposing, something with height and grandeur, but the Wizengamot sat in a circular chamber below street level, tiered seats rising on all sides in a bowl shape, and the lighting came from fixed magical torches that threw everything in amber and shadow, and at the center of it all was a single chair that had, unnecessarily, chains on its arms. Harry looked at the chair and decided the chair could wait. The 200 seats were not all full. It was an emergency session, convened on 36 hours' notice, but there were enough people to generate a constant low murmur that stopped when Harry walked in, the way conversations stop when something enters a room that changes its atmosphere. He felt them, all of them, their magical signatures like a weather system, and he sorted them as he walked. Here was fear, here was hostility dressed as concern, here was genuine compassion, here was careful neutrality being performed with great effort, and here, a cluster, left side, elevated seats, was something colder and more deliberate. He found Lucius Malfoy without needing to be told. The man sat like someone who'd arranged himself as an argument, pale, impeccably dressed, a kind of cultivated stillness that announced wealth the way a cough announces illness. He was watching Harry with silver-gray eyes that were doing complex arithmetic. Harry looked at him for a moment, direct and unimpressed, and then moved on. At the front of the chamber, elevated above the main floor on a raised bench, sat the acting chief warlock, Tiberius Ogden, who was old and compact with the look of a man who'd sat in this kind of room many times and had long ago stopped finding it comfortable but continued to find it necessary. He had a face like a knot in old wood and eyes that were, to Harry's magical sense, very clear. Not complicated. Just, clear. "Mr. Potter," Ogden said. "Please be seated." Harry sat in the chair, noting that the chains did not move. He put his hands on the armrests and looked around the bowl of watching faces and felt absolutely, precisely himself. "This session has been convened," Ogden said to the chamber at large, "to examine the findings of the Sorting Hat of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, as made on the evening of September the 1st, concerning one Harry James Potter, age 11. Those findings have been confirmed by the Department of Mysteries Senior Unspeakable Aldrich Croker, whose report has been distributed to all present." He paused. "Additionally, this session is asked to examine the behavior of one Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore in relation to those findings." He looked at Harry. "Mr. Potter, you are here as a primary witness. You are not on trial. You are not accused of any offense. Is that understood?" "Yes," Harry said. "Good." Ogden settled his papers. "Will you describe, in your own words, what occurred on the evening of September the 1st? Harry described it. He was concise and accurate, and when he reached the parts where he had drawn his own conclusions he labeled them clearly as his conclusions rather than presenting them as facts, which seemed to produce a distinct impression on several people in the room, including Ogden, who had probably not expected an 11-year-old witness to show his working. When Harry finished, the chamber was quiet for a moment. Then it opened. The first questioner was sympathetic, a round-faced witch named Augusta Longbottom who wanted to establish the timeline clearly and asked sensible questions about what Harry had known prior to the sorting, which was, almost nothing. She established with brisk efficiency that Harry had grown up without knowledge of the wizarding world, without knowledge of his own nature, and without any guardian who might have sought to inform or protect him. Harry answered and she thanked him with the clipped authority of someone who has already decided which way this should go and is laying bricks. The second questioner was less straightforward. He was a small man with a tidy mustache named Aldbert Runcorn who prefaced everything with "just to clarify" and then asked things that were not clarifications. "Just to clarify, Mr. Potter, you're describing these fragments as feeling, in your words, stable, and integrated with your own core. Is that accurate?" "That's what Croker's examination found," Harry said. "And it matches my own sense of them, yes. And you can feel them. Deliberately. You just told us that." "Yes. So you have conscious awareness of, and access to, 38 fragments of Lord Voldemort's soul. I have awareness of them, Harry said. What I can or can't do with that awareness is a separate question. Runcorn smiled thinly. But the access is there. Is there a specific question in here? Harry said pleasantly. Several people in the chamber made sounds. Runcorn's smile tightened. I'm simply establishing, you're establishing that I have dark magic inside me, Harry said. That's not in dispute. The question is whether I am responsible for that, and the answer is no, I was a baby. The question of what it means for my future is something that should be handled with the understanding that I'm a person, not a hazard. I'd be happy to discuss either of those things if you'd like to ask about them directly. Ogden's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. Runcorn sat down. The room buzzed. Harry looked at the far wall and let it buzz. The third questioner was Lucius Malfoy, and the chamber went quieter when he rose, the way rooms go quieter when something that has been waiting announces itself. Mr. Potter, Malfoy said, and his voice was a smooth, practiced instrument, the voice of someone who had used it for 30 years to make things happen. I want to begin by saying that no one in this chamber questions that you have been through an extraordinary ordeal. Thank you, Harry said, with the same flatness with which you'd say it's Tuesday. Malfoy paused, recalibrating at the lack of warmth to build on. The question that concerns many members of this body is not one of blame. Clearly, a child cannot be blamed for his circumstances. But a child can grow into an adult, and the question of what kind of adult we may be dealing with is, I think, fair to raise. Raise it directly, Harry said. Malfoy looked at him. Something moved in those silver eyes, a very brief reassessment, the kind you do when something is harder than you expected. 38 fragments of the most dangerous dark wizard of the last century are permanently integrated into your magical core. Your magical core, as Croker's report notes, has not been suppressed by this but amplified. You are 11 years old and apparently already testing as an adult wizard of, he glanced at his papers, significant natural talent, which I understand is a careful understatement. It is, Harry agreed. Malfoy looked up from his papers. He hadn't expected agreement. What's your question? Harry said. My question, Mr. Potter, is, what assurances can this body have that you will not become, through no fault of your own, but inevitably, given what you are, a danger equivalent to the one we spent a generation fighting? The chamber was very quiet. Harry looked at Lucius Malfoy. He felt the cold calculation in the man, felt it the way he felt the castle stones, as information. Malfoy didn't actually fear Harry, not the way some of the others did. He was using fear as a rhetorical tool because it was the most efficient one available, and underneath it was not ideology but strategy, and underneath that was the old familiar shape, a person protecting an existing advantage. I notice, Harry said, that your question assumes what I will become rather than what I choose. Which is interesting, because that assumption is exactly what was used to justify the treatment I received for the last 11 years. He met Malfoy's eyes steadily. Someone decided what I was before I had a chance to demonstrate who I was. That worked out quite badly. I'd think the Wisengamot would be cautious about making the same structural error. Murmurs. The warm kind, this time. With respect, Malfoy said, and every syllable of respect was its own small sarcasm, the structural error you're describing is one of certainty. I'm not claiming certainty. You're asking for preemptive management of a threat that doesn't exist yet and may never exist, Harry said. And the answer is, I don't provide assurances to rooms that haven't decided to treat me as a person yet. When the Wisengamot has established that I am a victim who deserves the same protections as any other victim, I'll be happy to discuss my future choices with people I'm accountable to. Until then, with respect, and he let the word land with its mirror of Malfoy's own irony, I think my behavior since Tuesday evening has demonstrated more good judgment than several of the adults in this chamber. Lucius Malfoy sat down. Not quickly, carefully, controlled, the sit of someone choosing to withdraw from a position rather than being pushed from it. But he sat. Someone in the upper tiers started clapping, and then several more people did, and Ogden called order without particularly feeling it necessary, and Harry sat in the chair with the chains that hadn't moved and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was plain stone and refreshingly free of significance. They brought Dumbledore in an hour later. He entered with the full authority of his presence intact, robes impeccable, beard immaculate, every inch the man who had run this world for 40 years, and if he was experiencing anything as humiliation he had converted it, as he apparently converted everything, into a kind of dignified gravity. He sat in the chair and the chains touched his wrists and he looked at them for a moment with an expression of profound irony and then looked up at the chamber. Harry was still in his seat, moved to the side of the chamber's floor. Ogden had offered him the option to leave for Dumbledore's questioning and Harry had declined with the simplicity of someone who didn't understand why leaving would be preferable. Ogden asked the formal questions. Dumbledore answered them with the full deployment of his particular genius for context. Yes, he had known about soul fragments in Harry. No, he had not reported this to the Ministry. Yes, he had placed magical suppressors on Harry's core. No, he did not consider this equivalent to harm. He was very good at this. Harry watched him build a structure out of answers, each one technically accurate, each one positioned to create a specific impression, the way stones can be true stones and still build a wall. It was impressive and he found it instructive. Then something happened that changed the shape of the session entirely. Madame Bones, who had been sitting to the side with her files and her monocle, raised her hand and Ogden called on her and she stood and said, without preamble, in addition to the confirmed presence of 7 fragments known to Dumbledore, the Department of Mysteries has now completed a preliminary analysis of the fragment signatures, their dates of formation, insofar as this is determinable. We have done this overnight. She opened a file. Of the 38 fragments, 7 are consistent with the period of Voldemort's original Horcrux creation, pre-1981. 1 is consistent with the night of James and Lily Potter's death, October 31, 1981. The remaining 30 are, she looked at the paper, the remaining 30 show evidence of post-1981 creation. The most recent is less than 6 months old. The chamber detonated. Not literally, the stone held, but the sound was something physical, hundreds of voices hitting the walls simultaneously, and Ogden was on his feet calling order with a voice that had the patience of someone who'd been in rooms like this for 60 years and knew they always came back to order eventually. Harry turned to look at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was looking at Bones, and on his face was something Harry had not expected, genuine shock. Not performed. Not managed. The actual expression of a man whose model of reality has just been handed a significant update it didn't ask for. Harry thought, he didn't know. He thought, which means someone else has been running a separate program for 30 years. He thought, and whoever that is has been very careful, and very patient, and has had 30 years to prepare for this moment. Order was restored by degrees. Ogden in a voice of tremendous controlled authority said that he was adjourning for 30 minutes and that anyone found spreading the session's contents to the press before its conclusion would be brought up on contempt charges, and the chamber settled into the specific careful quiet of people who have very much to say and are temporarily forbidden to say it. Bones crossed to Harry and sat beside him without preamble. 30 post-1981 fragments, she said quietly. Someone has been systematically, deliberately, creating new Horcruxes, or recreating old ones, and placing them in you, over a period of 30 years. The most recent within the past 6 months. Within the past 6 months, Harry said. While I was at the Dursleys. Yes. Which means they can reach me anywhere. Or they have someone close to me who, he thought about the Dursleys, Vernon and Petunia and Dudley, and tried to imagine one of them as a secret dark wizard, which was actually impossible on the basis of character. But someone who visited. Someone who had access without being family. Mrs. Figg, he said. Bones looked at him. Arabella Figg, Harry said. She's a neighbor. She used to watch me sometimes when the Dursleys went out. She was always, slightly odd about it. Slightly too aware of things. He paused. I don't think she's the one doing this. I think she might be connected to someone who is. Bones wrote the name down without question, the way a good investigator takes every thread and sorts them later. There's something else, Harry said. Yes. Dumbledore didn't know. I watched him when you gave the dates. That was real surprise. Harry looked across the chamber to where Dumbledore sat, still and somewhat diminished in the chair, talking in a very low voice with his own counsel. I think he's been running his plan with 7 fragments for 30 years while someone else was running a completely different plan around him, using him as cover. Dumbledore's mistake was too big and too visible to look past. It was a perfect screen. Bones looked at him for a long moment. You are 11 years old, she said. I know, Harry said. That is not a criticism. I know that too, Harry said. When the session reconvened, Ogden asked Dumbledore about the post-1981 fragments. Dumbledore's response was precise, clear, and devastating in what it admitted. He had believed, for 30 years, that the problem was contained. 7 fragments, a known quantity, part of a plan whose terrible outline Harry still didn't know in full but which he could feel in the shape of what had been done to him. Dumbledore had managed 7. He had not known about 30. Which meant, Dumbledore said, looking older than Harry had ever seen him look, that everything he had planned, every calculation he had made about what Harry's future needed to hold, had been made on the basis of wrong numbers. The prophecy, Dumbledore said, and the chamber went very still at the word, spoke of a boy with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord. I believed I understood what that meant. I believe now that someone else also understood it, and decided that if one such boy was good, then a boy made of the Dark Lord was better. And they have spent 30 years making certain that by the time anyone looked closely, it would be too late to separate what they had built from what was already there. Who? Ogden said. I don't know, Dumbledore said, and the admission seemed to cost him more than anything else had, because it was the admission that for 30 years, the person who was supposed to be watching most carefully had been comprehensively deceived. Harry looked at Dumbledore across the chamber and thought, you should have told me. About the 7 you knew. About any of it. That culpability remained, would always remain, and he wasn't going to set it aside. But the scale of what was in front of them, a hidden architect, 30 years of careful addition, someone who was still adding to what Harry carried as recently as 6 months ago, was genuinely larger than Dumbledore's guilt. He stood up. Mr. Potter, Ogden said, you may speak. Thank you. Harry looked around the chamber, at Malfoy, whose expression had gone carefully blank, at the sympathetic faces and the hostile ones and the frightened ones, at Dumbledore, who met his eyes with an expression that was close to an apology but couldn't quite get there. I want to make something clear to this chamber, Harry said. There are 2 separate problems here. The first is what Dumbledore knew and did and concealed, which is real and requires accountability. The second is what someone else has been doing for 30 years, which is more immediately dangerous. He paused, and the chamber listened, because whatever else they thought about him, he had demonstrated today that he was worth listening to. I don't want this session to finish without addressing both, he said. And I want to be involved in investigating the second. Not as a case file, not as the object that needs to be managed, as a participant. He looked at Bones. Because the one thing I can do that no one else in this building can is feel those fragments from the inside. I can feel them. I can learn from them. And if whoever did this has left traces in what they built, I'm the one who can find those traces. Bones looked at him steadily. I want a team, Harry said. Bones, Croaker, and someone from Dumbledore's side who he trusts, which probably means McGonagall. And I want Dumbledore provisionally cooperating, not detained, because his knowledge is going to be useful even if his judgment has been questionable. You're asking this chamber, Malfoy said, unable to help himself, to give an 11-year-old boy. I'm asking this chamber, Harry said, looking directly at Malfoy, to stop wasting time arguing about what I am and start doing something about who put me here. He paused. You don't have to like me, Mr. Malfoy. You have to make a decision about whether what I'm suggesting is the most sensible use of the available resources, and then you have to vote accordingly. Those are different things. Silence. Then Ogden said, "We will put the proposal to a vote." It passed. Not overwhelmingly, 112 to 78, with several abstentions from people who were very carefully hedging, but it passed, and the investigation team was formally authorized, and Dumbledore's provisional detention was modified to cooperative custody, and Harry was named, in language that took 3 redrafts before anyone was satisfied, as a participant investigator with protected witness status. Harry was 14 and listed as an investigating participant in a ministry task force, which was not a thing that existed in wizarding law and had to be invented that afternoon. He found this appropriate. Walking back through the ministry atrium with McGonagall at his side, Harry felt the 38 fragments humming in their quiet chord and thought about the unknown architect who had built the last 30 of them over a lifetime, patiently and precisely, while everyone looked somewhere else. Whoever they were very clever. They had also, Harry thought, made one significant mistake. They had built something, built it carefully, over 30 years, added to it, refined it, presumably planned to use it. But things that are built for a purpose, and the purpose lives in the builder's mind, and the builder had never, in all their careful planning, accounted for the built thing developing opinions. "You were extraordinary today," McGonagall said, quietly, as they reached the lifts. "I was paying attention," Harry said. "That's all. Most people, in front of the Wizengamot, find that very difficult." "Most people," Harry said, "have been allowed to not pay attention their whole lives." He watched the golden lift numbers. "I haven't had that option." She was quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking about?" "The architect," Harry said. 30 years. 30 additional fragments. Someone who knew about the prophecy, knew about Voldemort, knew about me. He paused. Someone with access to Horcrux magic at that level, who could reach me repeatedly for 11 years without anyone noticing. Someone patient enough to wait 30 years and careful enough to hide behind Dumbledore's more obvious mistake. "It's a very specific list of attributes," McGonagall said. "Yes," Harry said. "It's a short list." The lift arrived. They stepped in. The golden grills closed and they began to move upward toward the surface, toward the grey London sky and the spinning gold ministry seal and the world that was, outside these walls, just beginning to understand that something fundamental had changed. "How short?" McGonagall asked. Harry thought about the fragments, their age, their precise construction, their very specific flavor of knowledge. He thought about what they contained, not just terror but expertise, a very particular expertise in the mechanics of soul magic that went beyond theoretical understanding into the kind of knowledge that comes from practice. He thought about who, in the wizarding world, had that level of understanding. The list Dumbledore had told him was short. Dumbledore himself. And Voldemort's most intimate confidants. And possibly, Harry thought this very carefully, someone who had spent decades pretending to be on the right side while positioning themselves inside the very structures that would have examined the question. "Short enough," Harry said, "that I think we're going to find them." The lift bell chimed. The doors opened. Harry walked out into the light. Chapter 4, What the Darkness Taught Me. The first time Harry did accidental magic at Hogwarts, it wasn't an accident. He was in the first-floor corridor on Saturday morning, 3 days after the Wizengamot session, heading to the library, when 2 seventh-year Slytherins stepped out of a side passage and blocked his way. They were the specific kind of large that comes from several years of Quidditch and a comfortable upbringing, and they had the specific kind of confidence that comes from having always been physically bigger than whatever they wanted to intimidate. "Potter," the taller one said. His name was Marcus Flint and he had the face of someone who'd been told all his life that being frightening was the same as being powerful. "Heard you've got a bit of a pest problem. Inside your head." The other one, Warrington, Harry would later learn, laughed at this like it was funnier than it was. Harry stopped walking. He looked at them both with the calm unhurried attention of someone deciding whether a thing is worth his time, and concluded that it wasn't, but that walking away would create an incorrect impression about what he would and wouldn't tolerate. "Move," Harry said. "Or what?" Flint said. "Going to have the ministry arrest us too?" "Getting quite good at that, aren't you, having adults?" He stopped, because Harry had raised one hand, not dramatically, not with a wand. He didn't have a wand yet. The ministry paperwork for his wand purchase was still being sorted in the chaos of the past week, and the air between them had gone sharp and pressurized, the way air goes before lightning. Harry hadn't decided to do it. He'd felt the fragments shift, felt that cold strategic clarity rise up and present itself, and he'd reached for it the way you reach for a tool that fits your hand perfectly. Flint and Warrington both took a step back simultaneously, the automatic animal response to something that the body understands before the mind catches up. "Move," Harry said again. They moved. He walked through the space they'd left and down the corridor and didn't look back, and behind him he heard one of them say something to the other in a very low voice, and he heard the other one respond in a voice that had shed most of its bravado, and he felt the cold clarity settle back into the core of himself and the fragments and become part of the general background hum. He thought, "I should understand that better." He went to the library, but he didn't read what he'd planned to read. He sat at a table in the far corner and he closed his eyes and he felt the fragments with the same careful attention Flitwick used for unpicking charms, following each thread back to its source, mapping the landscape. What he found was this: the 7 original fragments were different from the 30 added later. The original 7 were the natural debris of a catastrophic magical event, a killing curse rebounding, a soul tearing under the strain of its own violence, pieces scattering the way glass scatters. They had the quality of something that had not been planned. Their content was fragmentary, impressionistic, more emotional than intellectual. Fear and rage and the specific agony of someone experiencing the dissolution of everything they'd arranged their existence around. The 30 later fragments were different in texture. They were too clean. Too constructed. They didn't have the quality of natural debris, they had the quality of manufactured parts. Each one was distinct, precisely bounded, carrying specific content as though it had been selected and packaged rather than scattered and absorbed. Some carried knowledge. That was the word for it. Not memories exactly, cleaner than memories. Specific, precise, transmissible knowledge about magic. About spells and their underlying mechanisms. About the deep architecture of magical theory that wasn't taught in schools because it was too fundamental, the way you don't teach architecture students how gravity works because you assume they already know. Harry opened his eyes. Someone had been building a library inside him. He went to find Hermione. She was in the library already, which was predictable, in the Transfiguration section, which was specific, with a stack of 6 books and the focused expression of someone on the trail of something. He sat across from her and said, "The 30 later fragments contain knowledge. Structured, organized magical theory. Someone was using me as a storage system." Hermione looked up from her book. Something moved across her face, first the intellectual excitement, which arrived immediately and honestly, and then the secondary response, which was the human recognition that what was intellectually fascinating was also something that had been done to a person without their consent. "What kind of knowledge?" she said. "The fundamental kind. The deep mechanics. Like," he thought about how to explain it, "like if you gave someone all the notes from every magical researcher of the last 500 years but put them in your head instead of a library." Hermione's pen was already out. "Can you access it deliberately? Intentionally?" "I think so. I've been careful about it so far because I don't fully understand what it is yet." He paused. "But this morning something happened." He told her about Flint and Warrington. She listened without interrupting, which was something she'd gotten better at over the past week. She had an instinct to problem solve in real time that occasionally produced interruptions, but she'd been working on it because she'd worked out that Harry thought better without interruptions. "You used it without deciding to," she said. "I reached for it when I needed it. Is that different?" She thought. Intentionality is a spectrum, she said. Instinctive use and deliberate use exist on a continuum. The fact that you reached for it rather than it forcing itself on you suggests you're in the driver's seat. She wrote something. But you should test it deliberately, under controlled conditions, before you rely on it in high-stakes situations. I need a wand first. Yes. She tapped her pen. The wand situation is taking too long. The ministry paperwork shouldn't require a month, it's not bureaucratic delay, Harry said. It's political delay. Someone in the ministry is holding the wand approval because a wandless Potter is more manageable than a wand one. Hermione looked at him. Do you know that or are you inferring it? Inferring. But I'm fairly confident. She added it to her notes under a column headed Ministry Politics, Hostile Actions, which already had 4 items. I'll ask Ron to ask his father. Already did this morning, Harry said. Also I've asked McGonagall to raise it formally. Someone needs to sign off at the level of Deputy Minister and McGonagall has enough weight to make it difficult to keep ignoring. Hermione put her pen down and looked at him with the expression she had when she'd revised her assessment of something and was acknowledging the revision. You think about this constantly, don't you? She said. All the angles. All the time. I don't have anything else to think about, Harry said. My life is this right now. That's not, she stopped. That's not healthy, probably. Probably not, he agreed. What were you researching? She glanced at the stack of Transfiguration books and seemed to decide the pivot was acceptable. Soul theory in Transfiguration literature. There isn't much, but the 18th century texts have better material than the modern ones because the ethical guidelines in the 1940s removed most of the relevant chapters. But if you look at what Phineas Nigellus wrote in 1743 about the relationship between magical core resonance and soul fragmentation, she slid the book across, there's something interesting. Harry looked. The text was dense, the handwriting style typesetting of something that had been transcribed from an original manuscript rather than typeset fresh, and the language was archaic but navigable. He read the relevant passage and felt something shift in his understanding, a click, the way a lock sounds when the right key turns. He's saying the fragments aren't just storage, Harry said. They're communicative. They're designed to transmit their content to the host over time. Yes, Hermione said. Like a slow infusion. Like someone setting up a drip of magical knowledge that would filter into your awareness gradually over years. So by the time you were an adult, I'd know everything that was in them, Harry said, without being able to point to where I learned it. It would just be knowledge I had. They looked at each other across the table. That's actually terrifying, Hermione said. It's also, Harry said slowly, quite useful if you're the person it was done to and you know it's happening. Hermione opened her mouth and then closed it and then opened it again. You're not going to wait for it to drip, she said. Why would I wait, Harry said, when I can just read? That afternoon Harry sat in the Gryffindor common room after everyone else had gone to dinner, and he was very still for 45 minutes, and he did something that he could only describe, afterward, as reading. It wasn't like reading a book. It was more like being in a room where every wall was a door and all the doors were open and all the rooms beyond them were full of information, and instead of walking through each door sequentially he could see down all the corridors simultaneously and choose which to follow. He moved through the structured knowledge in the later fragments with the care of someone in a new house, opening drawers and noting contents, not trying to use any of it yet, just mapping. Understanding what was there. What was there was extraordinary. Comprehensive magical theory from foundational principles upward. Spell construction, not just how to perform spells but how they were built, the grammatical rules of magic that made them work or fail, the underlying logic that most wizards treated as received wisdom rather than understood mechanism. The physics of magical energy, its relationship to intent and emotion, the way will and knowledge combined to produce effects that neither could produce alone. And in the deepest part of the later fragments, the most recently added ones, the ones created within the last few years, something else. More current. More tactical. specific knowledge about certain magical objects and their locations. About certain people and their magical signatures. Harry came out of it like surfacing from deep water. He sat in the common room and breathed and thought, whoever made those last fragments was leaving instructions. They weren't just storing knowledge for me to absorb. They were leaving me a map. The fireplace crackled. Somewhere above him the castle breathed. He sat with what he'd found and turned it over and looked at it from various angles, and the shape of it was becoming clearer, and the shape was not comfortable. Ron found him 20 minutes later, coming back from dinner with a piece of apple crumble wrapped in a napkin because he'd noticed Harry hadn't come down. "You're doing the thing where you stare at nothing," Ron said, sitting in the armchair opposite. "The thing where I think," Harry said. "Right, that." Ron offered the crumble. Harry took it. "Hermione told me what you said about the knowledge in the fragments." She was very excited and also very concerned simultaneously, which is sort of her standard state. "She's right to be both," Harry said. "What did you find?" Harry thought about how much to say. Not because he didn't trust Ron, he did, increasingly, with a trust that was built on Ron's consistent habit of being honest about what he felt rather than telling Harry what he thought Harry wanted to hear. But because some of what he'd found needed more time to sit before it became words. "I found instructions," he said. Ron's eyebrows went up. "In the most recent fragments. Someone was leaving me a map. Not a literal one, but information I'd need. Specific, targeted. About people and objects." He ate a bit of the crumble. "Whoever built the later fragments wasn't just hiding pieces of Voldemort's soul in me. They were communicating with me. They had a specific outcome in mind and they built tools for it inside a child." Ron was quiet for a moment. "That's worse than what I thought this morning," he said. "Yes. Is it?" Ron paused, trying to find the frame for his question. "Is it definitely hostile? The instructions. Could someone have been, trying to help, in a horrible misguided way?" Harry thought about this seriously, because it was a fair question and Ron had asked it carefully. "I don't know yet," he said. "The fragments don't come with tone. I can read what's there but I can't read intention. The map could be meant to guide me towards something good or towards something that serves someone else's interests at my expense." He finished the crumble. "Which is why I need to find who built them." "Croker's team is working on the signatures," Ron said. "Dad said Bones has put 4 unspeakables on it full time." "I know. I also think I might be faster than they are." Ron looked at him. "The signatures are in the fragments," Harry said. "The Maker's magical fingerprint. I can feel them from the inside. Croker can detect them from outside with instruments, but instruments have to know what they're looking for. I can just feel what's there and describe it." Ron thought about it. "That's actually brilliant. Have you told Croker?" "I'm going to. Tomorrow." Harry looked at the fire. "I wanted to understand it myself first. Before I hand it to someone who'll immediately start managing it." Ron nodded slowly, with the understanding of someone who'd grown up in a house where everything important was managed by someone else and had always slightly chafed at it. "Yeah," he said. "Fair." The common room door opened and Hermione came in with 3 books tucked under one arm and a parchment in her other hand that had clearly just been written on, the ink still fresh. She sat down without preamble. "I found something," she said. "About Horcrux signatures and their dating. The formula Croker's team is using to date the post-1981 fragments is based on standard soul magic decay curves, but those curves assume the fragments were created through the standard method, murder. If the fragments were created through a different mechanism, the curve would be wrong." Harry and Ron both looked at her. "What different mechanism?" Harry said. "That's what I've been trying to work out. But if the later fragments weren't created by murder, if there's another method, something experimental or theoretically possible but not documented in the mainstream literature, then Croker's dates might be significantly off." She spread her parchment on the coffee table. Which means the 30 later fragments might not span 30 years. They might span a much shorter period. Or, she paused, or a much longer one. Harry was very still. If the creation date is wrong, he said, the creator profile changes. Yes, Hermione said. The current profile assumes someone active for 30 years. If the timeline is different, the list of possible creators is different. Have you told Croker? Harry asked. I thought I'd tell you first, she said, and there was something very simple and very complete in how she said it. Harry looked at her, this girl who'd arrived at Hogwarts with her chin up and her knowledge fully deployed, who had adopted Harry's problem as a problem worth her intelligence within approximately 36 hours of meeting him, who had a moral compass that pointed in the same direction as her intellectual instincts, and he thought, I am not going to take this for granted. Thank you, he said, and meant more than the word usually carries. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who understands subtext. We'll tell Croker together tomorrow, she said. United Front. The wand permission came through Sunday evening, not because of bureaucratic process but because McGonagall had apparently sent a letter directly to the deputy minister whose precise contents no one was sharing but which had produced results in under 18 hours. Monday morning Harry went to Diagon Alley with McGonagall and a ministry escort that he did not need and hadn't asked for but that someone higher up had decided was appropriate, possibly for his protection and possibly so that someone could say, afterward, that they'd been there. Ollivander's shop was narrow and dusty and smelled of something that had no equivalent in the Muggle world, old wood and something older still, the smell of potential waiting to be released. Ollivander himself was exactly what his shop looked like, narrow, dusty, ancient, and full of things that were waiting. He looked at Harry for a long moment before saying anything, and his pale eyes moved the way pale eyes move in faces that are doing real work behind them. Mr. Potter, he said, and his voice was a librarian's voice, precise and carrying. I have been wondering when you would come. I've been dealing with some things, Harry said. Yes. Ollivander looked at him steadily. I know what you carry. I can feel it from here. Remarkable. He didn't say it the way people had been saying remarkable all week, with the particular mixture of awe and apprehension. He said it the way a craftsman says it about a piece of work that solved a problem in an unexpected way. This will require care. Wands are attuned to the user's magical core, Harry said. My core has a more complex configuration than usual. Substantially, Ollivander agreed. Standard attenuation won't work. We need something with sufficient flexibility to accommodate. He was already moving between the shelves, pulling boxes, opening and discarding with efficient fluency, the resonance breadth. He offered the first wand. Harry held it. Nothing. 6 more. Nothing, or wrong, or a small shower of sparks that Ollivander looked at with mild dissatisfaction. The 8th wand was holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, and when Harry's fingers closed around it something happened that was not the usual sparks and warmth of a wand finding its wizard. It was more like the chord in his chest, the fragments in his own core, always present, always humming, suddenly finding an instrument it could play through. The air in the shop moved. Ollivander watched this with absolute attention. Yes, he said softly. There it is. The phoenix feather is from Fawkes. Dumbledore's phoenix. He paused. Its brother feather is in the wand of Lord Voldemort. Harry looked down at the wand in his hand. You'll be getting more than sparks when the time comes, Ollivander said, and his voice had something in it that wasn't quite ominous and wasn't quite hope, but sat between them like weather. That wand knows what it's connected to. It will work differently for you than it would for anyone else. I'm starting to expect that, Harry said. Back at Hogwarts by early afternoon, wand in his pocket and the ministry escort departed at the gates, Harry went to the first-floor classroom McGonagall had quietly set aside for his individual practice. It was empty except for what she'd had brought in, targets, basic spell reference materials, and a note that said, "Use this time well. No one will interrupt." He stood in the empty room and took the wand out and felt the connection. his core, the fragments, the wand, all of them aligned like instrument strings tuned to each other, and he thought about what he'd mapped in the fragments, the deep theory, the mechanics. He didn't start with Wingardium Leviosa. He started with the principles. With what he now understood about the relationship between intent and magical output, that the words were scaffolding, not structure, that the wand was an amplifier and focuser, not a source, that the real engine was will directed by understanding. He thought about a specific problem, a stone on the practice table, and he applied the principles, and he thought the target, and he moved the stone. Not a feather. A 3-pound chunk of granite. It moved a meter sideways and stopped exactly where he'd intended it to stop. He stood very still for a moment. Then he worked. He worked for 2 hours, and what he was doing was not the careful, stumbling practice of a first year finding their magical footing. It was something more like a musician who has had perfect pitch their whole life and has just been given an instrument, the technique needed building, the specific physical skills of wand movement and pronunciation, but the underlying musicianship was already there, comprehensive and developed, because it had been developing in the dark for 11 years without anyone telling it to. By the end of 2 hours he could perform every standard first-year charm with effortless precision, had successfully completed most second-year charms, and had attempted and partially succeeded at a third-year shield charm that Flitwick had apparently spent a full term teaching in his 6th-year class. He wasn't showing off. There was no one to show. He was building vocabulary. Hermione found him there at 4 o'clock because she'd looked for him in the library and the common room and the grounds and had logically concluded he must be practicing. She stood in the doorway of the classroom and watched him work for approximately 30 seconds before she said anything. What she saw, he would learn this later, was Harry standing in the center of the room with 3 stones floating at different heights, executing precise movements with a wand while simultaneously maintaining the floating objects, which should have required split attention and didn't seem to require it at all. His face was focused but relaxed, the face of someone for whom the effort was real but within comfortable reach. "You're already at 2nd year," she said. "3rd, for some things," he said, setting the stones down carefully. "The shield charm needs more work." She came in and sat on a practice table and pulled out her notebook with the automatic comfort of someone for whom note-taking was a natural response to everything. "Can I watch? And take notes?" "Yes," he said. "Will you talk me through what you're doing? While you do it?" He thought about this. "Yes," he said, "and you tell me when the theory doesn't match what you already know. Because the theory I'm working from is inside the fragments and I want to know if it contradicts the mainstream version." She looked at him with bright, sharp eyes. "Deal," she said. They worked until dinner, and what they built in that afternoon was not just Harry's magical education but the beginning of a system, Harry's instinctive access to deep theory informing his practice, Hermione's comprehensive academic knowledge cross-checking and correcting and building framework around it. They operated on different strengths that happened to be precisely complementary, and both of them noticed this without saying it, and the not saying felt comfortable rather than awkward. Ron found them on the way to dinner and fell into step beside Harry and said, "McGonagall wants us in her office after dinner. She got a letter from Croaker." "About the signatures?" Harry said. "About a specific signature," Ron said. "Which apparently Croaker thinks he's identified. Or nearly identified." He paused. He thought about it, "Dad says Croaker doesn't have a nervous voice. He apparently said this letter was the closest to nervous he's ever heard him." Harry thought about what he'd found in the deepest fragments. The map. The instructions. The very specific kind of knowledge that only existed in very specific kinds of minds. "All right," he said. McGonagall's office after dinner was crowded with purpose, McGonagall behind her desk, Flitwick in the corner, Croaker standing with his notebook open to a page of small dense writing, and on the desk a single piece of parchment that had Croaker's signature at the bottom and the purple ministry seal of the Department of Mysteries. Harry sat. Ron and Hermione sat beside him, and McGonagall looked at them for a moment with the expression of someone who has accepted that these three come as a set and has found this acceptable. "Croaker," McGonagall said. Croaker looked up from his notebook. He looked, Harry noted, like someone who had slept very little in the past several days, which for a man of his particular professional disposition meant the findings were significant. The magical signature of the post-1981 fragments is unlike anything in our standard registry, Croker said. The registry covers every known magical practitioner in Britain and the broader European wizarding community. We expanded the search to international registries. Nothing matched. He paused. That's not unusual for dark magic practitioners of the highest level, they sometimes develop core signatures that diverge significantly from registered baselines. Voldemort's signature itself had diverged substantially from his Hogwarts-era registration. But? Harry said. Croker looked at him. But partial matches are still informative. And we found a partial match. He looked at the parchment on the desk. The signature in the later fragments shares specific characteristics with Voldemort's own signature. Which is expected, Horcrux fragments carry their maker's signature. What's unexpected is the deviation pattern from that signature. The deviation pattern, Harry said carefully, would indicate the specific way the fragment was modified from the original. Croker looked at him with the specific look he reserved for moments when Harry said something that indicated more understanding than expected. Yes. And the deviation pattern in the post-1981 fragments matches the pattern of someone who began with Voldemort's techniques and developed them further. Someone who learned from him directly and then went beyond what they were taught. The office was very quiet. That narrows it considerably, Hermione said. It does, Croker said. Voldemort did not teach many people his deepest techniques. The list of individuals with sufficient access and sufficient skill is, he opened his notebook to a specific page, extremely short. How short? McGonagall asked. 3 or 4 people at most, Croker said. Of those, several are confirmed dead. 1 is unaccounted for. 1 is, he paused, and the pause had the weight of something he was choosing carefully, currently in a position to have had consistent access to Harry over the past 11 years. Harry thought about the map in the fragments. The instructions, the targeted knowledge. The someone who had been building something specific. He thought about what Dumbledore had said, I believe now that someone else also understood it, and decided that if one such boy was good, then a boy made of the Dark Lord was better. He thought about someone who had learned from Voldemort directly and gone beyond what they were taught. Someone patient. Someone who took 30 years. Someone who was very clever and had hidden very well. Who? He said. Croker looked at him, and then at McGonagall, and then back at the parchment. We're not ready to name them yet, he said. We need more evidence before, Croker, Harry said, quietly. Croker stopped. I found the map, Harry said. In the deepest fragments. Someone left instructions for me. Targeted information. I have been careful about telling you what's in the fragments because I wanted to understand them myself first, and I'm telling you now because we need to move. He met Croker's eyes. If you've got a name and you're being careful with it, I understand. But I need to know, because I need to know who I'm dealing with and what they want from me. The map points somewhere. I can follow it but I need to know whose map it is. Croker held his gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at McGonagall. McGonagall said nothing, which Croker seemed to read as permission. The name we have, Croker said, setting his notebook down with the careful movement of someone putting down something heavy, is Quirinus Quirrell. Hermione inhaled sharply. Ron sat up. McGonagall's expression did not change but her hands, folded on the desk, tightened very slightly. Harry thought about the first evening, the sorting, the aftermath, the 2 days of ministry examinations. He thought about who had been in the school that whole time, watching, and who had been entirely unremarkable in the chaos of it because unremarkable was what they did. The defense against the dark arts teacher, Harry said. Yes, Croker said. Who is already in this building, Harry said. Yes, Croker said. Has anyone put any surveillance on him? Harry said. Croker's expression did something. Has anyone put surveillance on him? Harry said, with the patience of someone who already knows the answer and is giving the room one opportunity to be better than they suspect. Croaker picked up his notebook. I'm authorizing it now, he said, and the tight-clipped way he said it was the sound of someone who was annoyed at themselves. I'll go to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement tonight, Bones said, which made Harry realize she'd been in the room, standing behind Croaker, so quiet he'd nearly missed her, which was a thing Bones did apparently, placed herself in rooms without announcing it and let the room's conversation develop around her. And I'll want Harry's account of what he found in the map before morning. You'll have it, Harry said. After Croaker and Bones left, the room was quieter. McGonagall looked at the three of them and said, I want you to understand something. Yes. Harry said. Quirrell has been at this school all week, she said. He was in the Great Hall on Tuesday night when the hat made its announcement. He has heard everything the school has heard, and if he's what Croaker believes he has had time to prepare for exactly this moment. He is not safe. I know, Harry said. I'm not saying that as a caution about what you should do, McGonagall said, with an emphasis that was unusual for her. I'm saying it so that you understand the situation clearly. Harry looked at her. You're saying he'll move first. I'm saying, she paused. If Quirrell built those fragments. If he's been running this plan for 30 years. And if he knows we found the edges of it, she met Harry's eyes, he won't wait to be arrested. Harry thought about the map in the fragments. The instructions. The targeted knowledge. He thought about what someone with 30 years of preparation and a very specific outcome in mind would do when they realized the timeline had accelerated. He thought about what the map was for. He built me as a container, Harry said slowly. 30 fragments, plus the knowledge in them, plus the map. He's been building towards something specific. Something that requires me in a specific state. He felt the fragments, the cord, the deep architecture of everything stored in him. The question is whether he wants me to find the map and use it, or whether he built it for himself. Whether I'm meant to follow the instructions or whether I'm the vehicle for someone else to. McGonagall was very still. If the fragments were meant to be recovered, Harry said, if Quirrell's plan eventually involves taking back what he stored, then he'll want me accessible. Not dead. Intact. He thought about this. Which means I'm safer than anyone else in this building right now. Ron said, that's either very reassuring or very alarming. Both, Harry said. The thing Harry didn't say aloud, partly because he was still working it out and partly because he needed to understand it better before he handed it to anyone, was what he'd found in the map's deepest layer. Not instructions. Instructions implied a sequence, a task list. What he'd found was more like a relationship. A conversation built into stone, addressed to whoever found it, that began with, if you are reading this, you already know most of what I am about to tell you, because I built you to know it. What you don't know yet is why. Someone had been waiting for Harry to reach this point. Waiting with patience and very considerable intelligence for the child they'd built to become capable of having this specific conversation. The why was there, somewhere in the deepest fragment, but Harry hadn't reached it yet. He'd surface before he got there, instinctively, with the sense that some doors should be opened only when you know what's on the other side. He lay in his bed that night and thought about Quirrell, a man he'd never properly met, had seen once or twice in the corridor, had filed as unremarkable because unremarkable was precisely the point, and tried to build a person from what he knew. A teacher. Someone who'd apparently been perfectly ordinary before going abroad, returning somehow changed, some said afflicted with a stammer, some said afraid of his own subject. Or, Harry thought, someone who had come back from wherever they'd been with something they needed to keep very still and very quiet, and had built a persona designed to not be looked at. Someone waiting. He was still thinking about it when the dormitory door burst open and the alarm that McGonagall had placed on the school's wards went off simultaneously, a high clear note like a bell struck by something urgent, and he was on his feet and his wand was in his hand before he'd consciously decided to reach for it. The dormitory's other occupants, Dean, Seamus, Neville, scrambled upright with the confusion of people wrenched from deep sleep. "Stay here," Harry said. "What?" Neville started. "Stay here," Harry said, and walked out of the dormitory. The common room was empty. The fire was low. Beyond the portrait hole the castle's nighttime noises had changed quality, less settled, more alert, the way stone changes when something passes through it that it doesn't recognize. Ron was in the doorway of his dormitory in 3 seconds, which was faster than Harry expected, and said something about Ron that Harry would remember later. "Where?" Ron said. "Third floor," Harry said. He didn't know how he knew. The fragments knew, something in the map had just activated, a response to a specific trigger, and it was producing direction the way a compass produces north. "There's something on the 3rd floor that matters. Something Quirrell is moving toward." "The Philosopher's Stone," Hermione said, appearing from the girls' dormitory stairs in robes she'd clearly pulled on in the dark. Harry looked at her. "It's at Hogwarts," she said. "I found references in 3 different places over the past week. Dumbledore had it moved here from Gringotts for safekeeping. It's in the 3rd floor corridor, and if Quirrell has been building toward something that requires immense magical power as a catalyst," Harry said, feeling the fragments shift and align, the knowledge in them snapping into framework. "Philosopher's Stone. Elixir of life. If he's not just hiding Horcruxes in me, if he's been preparing to reconstitute Voldemort properly, actually properly, not just fragments but a full embodied return, he needs the stone," Hermione said. "He needs the stone," Harry agreed. He went to the portrait hole. "Harry," Hermione said. "We should get McGonagall. We should get Dumbledore. We should go right now," Harry said, and his voice was very even, "because the map in my head just told me that we have approximately 8 minutes before he gets through the last of the protective enchantments, and it takes McGonagall 6 minutes to get from her quarters to the 3rd floor, and that leaves 2 minutes of margin that I would prefer to have available." He looked at her. "You can go wake McGonagall. That is genuinely the most useful thing you can do right now. Take Ron." Ron opened his mouth. "Or Ron comes with me and you get McGonagall," Harry said. "I'd prefer the second option." Hermione looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read in the firelight, then she turned and ran for the stairs, and Harry heard her moving fast, decisive, already committed. He and Ron went through the portrait hole. The castle at night was beautiful and strange, torches throwing long shadows, the portraits sleeping in their frames, the stonework doing what good stonework does, holding everything up without making a fuss about it. They moved quickly and quietly, and Harry navigated without consulting anything external, following the pull of the map's direction, and Ron kept pace with him without asking questions, which Harry noted and appreciated. 3rd floor corridor. The door at the end that everyone had been told not to enter. Harry put his hand on it and it opened, because whatever lock had been on it had recently been forced by someone who knew what they were doing. They went through. What was beyond the door was a sequence of obstacles, a large unconscious 3-headed dog, its sleep clearly magically induced, and beyond it a trapdoor that had already been opened. Harry looked at the unconscious dog for a moment. "That's a very large dog," Ron said. "Cerberus," Harry said. "Fluffy. Hagrid's, I think." He felt something from the fragments, a note of recognition, a flagging of specific knowledge. The music box. Quirrell put it to sleep with music and left it playing. A small music box sat a few feet away, tinkling softly. Harry reached down and closed it. The dog's 3 heads shifted in their sleep but did not wake. "That was," Ron started. "It'll wake in a few minutes," Harry said. "We need to be through the trapdoor before then." They went through. What followed was a sequence of challenges that Dumbledore had clearly constructed with some care, and Quirrell had moved through with the combination of advanced knowledge and raw skill, a plant with magical properties that Harry recognized from the fragment knowledge as Devil's Snare, a room of flying keys, a life-sized chess set with pieces that had been blasted aside, a sleeping troll, and finally a puzzle with 7 differently labeled potion bottles and a logic problem that someone had Solved and left unbalanced. Harry and Ron moved through them all. The plant they navigated by knowing its weakness without having to work it out. The keys Harry spotted in under 20 seconds. The chess pieces had already been dealt with by whoever had come through before. The troll was down. The potion puzzle, Harry looked at it for a moment, felt the deep theory in the fragments orient toward it, and identified the correct bottle immediately. How do you do that? Ron said, watching him work. I'm reading, Harry said. There's nothing written down. Not where you can see it, Harry said, and drank the correct potion and stepped through the black flame. The final chamber was lit by purple fire. Quirrell was there. He was standing in front of a large ornate mirror, and he turned when Harry came through the flame, and his face was, not what Harry had expected. Not monstrous. Not the face of someone who had spent 30 years in dark obsession and wore it on their features. He looked like what he'd always looked like in the corridors, mild, slightly pale, the kind of face that moved through rooms without catching on anything. Except now he wasn't performing the stammer. And his eyes, looking at Harry, had the quality of something that had waited a very long time and recognized the moment it had been waiting for. Harry, Quirrell said. Professor, Harry said. They looked at each other across the chamber, and the mirror stood between them with its ornate frame catching the purple firelight, and Harry felt the map in the fragment suddenly, completely illuminate, every connection, every thread, the full architecture of 30 years of planning visible all at once the way a room becomes visible when you turn the lights on. And in the deepest layer of the map, the layer he hadn't reached yet, the message that had been waiting for this specific moment, now you know why. And now you have a choice. Chapter 5, Albus Dumbledore's last great argument. Quirrell didn't reach for his wand. That was the first thing Harry noticed. A man who had spent 30 years building toward this moment, who had moved through 7 protective enchantments with clinical efficiency, who stood 10 feet from the object of his entire plan, and he didn't reach for his wand when Harry walked through the black flame. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at Harry with the patience of someone who has calculated every possibility and found them all acceptable. That was more frightening than aggression would have been. You found the map, Quirrell said. Yes, Harry said. All of it? Enough. Quirrell looked at him with those mild eyes that weren't mild at all, that were, Harry could feel now without the suppressors to blunt it, extraordinarily complex, like looking at a mathematical proof written in a language you mostly but not entirely understand. His magical signature was dense and strange, familiar in its foundations because Harry had been living with its architecture inside him for years and was only now meeting the architect. You're not afraid of me, Quirrell said, and it wasn't an accusation. It was an observation delivered with something that sounded almost like professional admiration. No, Harry said. Most people are. Most people don't have 30 fragments of your work inside them, Harry said. You built me to understand you. It's difficult to be afraid of someone you understand. Something moved across Quirrell's face, not guilt, not warmth exactly, but something between them. Recognition, perhaps. The look of a craftsman meeting their work for the first time as an independent entity. Ron had come through the flame behind Harry and stood slightly to his left and back, not hiding behind Harry, but placing himself where he was useful rather than central, which was the correct tactical instinct. Harry noted it without looking at him. Why don't you reach for your wand? Harry asked. Because I'm not going to attack you, Quirrell said simply. That's not the same as not being a threat. No, Quirrell agreed. It isn't. Harry looked at the mirror between them. The mirror of Eriste, he knew it from the fragments, its properties and purpose, Dumbledore's specific enchantment that hid the stone inside it. The stone was still there. Quirrell had not yet extracted it, which meant either the enchantment was holding him off or, you can't get it, Harry said. Quirrell looked at the mirror. Not yet, he said. Dumbledore's enchantment. Only someone who wants the stone but not to use it. Clever man, Quirrell said, and his voice had something in it when he said it, not admiration exactly. Something older than admiration. He always was. He paused. Can you get it? Harry felt the map in the fragments, the deep architecture of everything Quirrell had built, and he understood the question. You think I can because of what you put in me? I know you can, Quirrell said. The knowledge of the enchantment. The intent, you're 11 years old with no plans to use the stone. Dumbledore's enchantment would read you as exactly the right kind of person. He looked at Harry directly. That's why I needed you to reach this point. That's why the map was there. You built me to be your key, Harry said. I built you to have options, Quirrell said, and for the first time his voice had something in it that wasn't entirely controlled. There's a difference. Ron said, very carefully, from behind Harry, that's still using him. Yes, Quirrell said, looking at Ron with the mild surprise of someone who'd expected to be corrected and is acknowledging the point. It is. Harry looked at the mirror. He could see himself in it, himself and the stone, which in the mirror's peculiar enchanted logic he could see in his own reflection's pocket. He could step forward and get it. He could feel the truth of what Quirrell had said, the enchantment would pass him through because he genuinely didn't want to use it. He didn't step forward. Tell me why, Harry said. The deepest layer said I'd have a choice when I knew why. Tell me. Quirrell was quiet for a long moment. The purple fire crackled. Somewhere far above them the castle moved in the particular way castles move when their occupants are stirring, McGonagall and Dumbledore, presumably, working their way down through the enchantments. Voldemort is not dead, Quirrell said. I know, Harry said. He is not whole either. He is, persistent. A remnant. He has been sharing my body for months, which is, a very brief pause in which Harry felt the fragments register something like revulsion, unpleasant. And temporary. He is too weak to maintain it indefinitely. Quirrell looked at him with those complicated eyes. Without the stone he will fade. Completely. Finally. And you want the stone to prevent that, Harry said. No, Quirrell said. Harry waited. I want the stone to end it, Quirrell said. Permanently. The elixir of life can do what any sufficiently powerful magic can do, it can create the conditions for a specific outcome. Voldemort, in his current state, could be brought to full presence with the elixir. Fully present, fully real, fully, he paused again, fully killable. The chamber was very quiet. The fragment process, Quirrell said. The 30 I added to you. I didn't do it to build a weapon for him. I did it because the only magic capable of permanently destroying a soul that has been fractured as many times as his requires someone who carries enough of that soul to serve as an anchor. Horcrux fragments can find each other. They want to reconstitute. If you carry enough of him, and he is brought to full presence in a single body, every fragment he ever made will try to return to him, including the ones in you. And if they all return to one point, Harry said, feeling the logic settle like architecture, the deep theory in the fragments snapping into place around the explanation, they can all be destroyed at one point. Yes, Quirrell said. Not 7 separate Horcrux hunts. Not years of searching and destroying individual objects one by one. One moment, one choice, one child, Harry said. Quirrell met his eyes. Yes. Who was never asked. No, Quirrell said, and the word sat in the air simply, with no scaffolding built around it. You weren't. I made choices about your life without your knowledge or consent, and the fact that I believed my reasons were good does not change what I did. He held Harry's gaze. I'm asking now. That's not how asking works, Harry said. I know. You can't do something to someone for 11 years and then retroactively make it a question. I know that too. Quirrell's voice was even. I'm not asking you to forgive the process. I'm asking you to consider the outcome. Harry looked at him for a long moment. He thought about the fragments, all 38 of them, their weight, their knowledge, the map built for this moment. He thought about a man who had been patient and clever and completely willing to use a child as a mechanism, who had built an entire plan around a boy he'd never met, who had had enough conviction in his own intelligence to trust that the boy he'd built would reach this conclusion and make this choice. He thought, "You are exactly the kind of person who makes catastrophic mistakes while being completely certain you're right." He thought, "And you might also be right." "There's a body on your head," Harry said. Quirrell went very still. "Voldemort," Harry said. "He's been using you as a host. You said it's been months. You know, I can feel magical signatures now. And his is coming from behind you, not from you." Harry kept his voice entirely conversational. "How long have you had control of your own actions?" A long silence. "It varies," Quirrell said, and for the first time there was something raw underneath the even voice. "He is loud when he wants something. He has been loud about the stone. About you." He paused. "He does not know about the plan. He thinks the fragments were made for him. He thinks you are the weapon he has been promised. He thinks someone built him a body," Harry said. "Yes. And instead, Quirrell said, I built him a trap." Behind Harry, Ron made a sound. Harry heard him processing, felt the shape of his understanding catching up with the conversation, and trusted him to hold it together. "How much of what I'm talking to right now is you?" Harry asked. Quirrell looked at him with an expression of extraordinary honesty, which was the expression of someone who has stopped managing their presentation because the situation has moved beyond the point where presentation is useful. "Enough," he said. "Right now, enough. He is, elsewhere in my mind. Planning. He expects me to be working on the enchantment." "So we have a window," Harry said. "Yes," Quirrell said. "A short one." Harry turned and looked at Ron. Ron looked back at him with the face that Harry had come to understand meant, "I'm with you, tell me what you need, and I recognize that this is insane but I'm not going anywhere." He turned back to Quirrell. "I'm not going to get the stone for you," Harry said. Quirrell nodded once, as though he'd expected this. "I'm not going to help you rebuild Voldemort, even with the intention of destroying him, because the number of things that could go wrong in that plan is enormous and you have already demonstrated a willingness to make catastrophic choices with my life based on your own certainty." Harry paused. "What I'm going to do is this. You're going to tell me everything about Voldemort's current state, everything about the Horcruxes, everything about what he's made and where they are. And then the people with actual authority to act on that information are going to handle it properly, with you cooperating, and you're going to answer for what you did." Quirrell was quiet. "And in exchange," Harry said, "I'm going to tell the Wisengamot that you cooperated. That you had reasons, however wrongly acted on. That the plan, if removed from the process, has merit worth examining." He met Quirrell's eyes. "I'm not forgiving you. I'm being practical. The information you have is more valuable than the punishment you deserve, and getting one requires temporarily deferring the other. I think you're intelligent enough to understand that." Quirrell looked at him for a very long moment. "You're 11 years old," he said, and there was something in it that wasn't disbelief, it was something more like the recognition of miscalculation, the slight wonder of finding that what you built exceeded your specifications. "I'm aware," Harry said. "He'll fight," Quirrell said. "When he knows. The temperature in the chamber dropped 3 degrees in an instant. Harry felt it before he heard anything, felt it in the fragments, which responded to the presence the way iron filings respond to a magnet, turning and orienting, every one of the 38 pointing toward the same source. It was Voldemort's signature and it was enormous, not physical, not fully present, but a force of will and hatred so concentrated that the purple fire wavered and the stones of the chamber seemed to lean away from it. Quirrell's face changed. Not transformed, the face stayed the same face, the mild features unchanged, but whatever had been in it went somewhere else, and what replaced it was different in quality. The eyes were the same eyes. The voice, when it came, was not. "Harry Potter," said a voice using Quirrell's throat, and it was like hearing a very beautiful piece of music played in a completely wrong key. "We meet at last. We've met several times this week, Harry said. You've just been very quiet about it. A pause. The presence in the chamber intensified, pressing against the walls. You're not afraid. People keep noticing that, Harry said. You should be, the voice said, and the fire went lower still. I am Lord Voldemort. I have killed wizards who made Albus Dumbledore weep. I have. You're currently living in the back of someone's head, Harry said. With no body, no wand, no independent means of action, and an increasingly narrow window before the ministry arrives upstairs. He watched the fire. I understand you were much more impressive before the night you tried to kill me. I'll take your word for it. The fire surged. The walls of the chamber groaned. You carry my soul, Voldemort said, and his voice had dropped to something below sound, something that resonated in the chest. 38 pieces of everything I am, 38 pieces of who you were, Harry said. And what they taught me, mostly, is how afraid you are. Were. Are. He tilted his head. You were terrified of dying and you made yourself into something that can barely call itself living in order to avoid it. From the inside, that's, he paused, choosing the word honestly, it's actually very sad. The temperature plummeted. Harry felt the force of will in the room hit him like pressure, like being underwater, and he stood in it and felt the fragments respond, not aligning with Voldemort, not pulled toward the presence the way Voldemort probably expected, but generating something from themselves that pushed back, the same way two magnets with the same pole repel. The fragments were his. Had been his for 11 years. They were not going home. He raised his wand. I'm not going to fight you, Harry said, which was technically true in the sense that what he was about to do was not a fight. A fight implied two parties with comparable positioning. This was something else. He didn't cast a spell. He understood, from the deep theory in the fragments, that spells were scaffolding, and that the presence in Quirrell's body was too dispersed, too attached to its host, for standard magic to separate them cleanly. What it was vulnerable to was the thing it had always been vulnerable to, the thing it had never been able to replicate or acquire despite all its power, the magic that came from genuine willingness to act in another person's interest. His mother had used it on him without knowing what she was doing. Harry, knowing exactly what he was doing, used it now. He stepped forward and put his hand on Quirrell's arm. The effect was immediate and catastrophic, for Voldemort. The presence in the chamber convulsed, made a sound that was not a sound exactly but that every stone in the room registered as one, and the temperature spiked from freezing to burning in an instant, and Quirrell screamed, and Harry held on, and the fragments inside him lit up like a coal caught by a sudden wind, all 38 of them responding to the contact, resonating with the presence trying to hold on through Quirrell's body, and pulling. Not toward Voldemort. Away from him. Confirming, in the language of soul magic, what Harry had said, these are mine. These were yours. They are not anymore. It lasted perhaps 15 seconds. It felt longer. When Harry stepped back, Quirrell collapsed. Not dramatically, his knees went, and he sat on the stone floor of the chamber with the movement of someone from whom something enormous has just been removed, and his face was his face again, fully his, with the expression of a man who has been in a very small space with something terrible and has suddenly been given room to breathe. The chamber was warm. The purple fire burned steadily. The presence was gone. Not destroyed. Harry understood that, felt the absence in the fragments, which had registered the departure rather than the annihilation. Voldemort without a body was persistent, and he had fled the way he'd fled before, insubstantial and diminished but not finished. But diminished. More diminished than before. And the map in the fragments, the instructions, the architecture of what Quirrell had built, was very clear about what diminished meant in the long run when done correctly, and what came next. Ron was beside him. Harry hadn't heard him move but he was there, and his hand came down briefly on Harry's shoulder with the economy of someone who doesn't do unnecessary gestures and therefore does them precisely when they matter. All right? Ron said. Yes, Harry said. He looked down at Quirrell, who was breathing and conscious and looking up at him with an expression that had moved somewhere beyond calculation into something more basic. "You could have used the stone," Quirrell said. His voice was raw. "Without me in the way you could have gotten it from the mirror and had the power to." "No," Harry said. "I couldn't have. Not because I can't. Because I decided not to." He crouched down to Quirrell's level. "That's the difference. You spent 30 years building me into something that would make the right choice under the right conditions. But I'm making the choice. Not because you built the conditions. Because I looked at the options and chose." Quirrell was quiet for a moment. "Does it make a difference?" he asked, and it wasn't rhetorical, it was genuine. "To me it does," Harry said. He stood. He turned to Ron. "Go back up and find McGonagall. Tell her Quirrell is secured, the stone is safe, and Voldemort's gone, temporarily." He paused. "And tell her I need Dumbledore." Ron raised his eyebrows. "Dumbledore. Dumbledore," Harry said. "Because we're past the point of dealing with this in pieces." McGonagall arrived in 6 minutes exactly. She came through the sequence of enchantments with the practice speed of someone who'd helped design half of them and the expression of someone who has been mentally preparing for a difficult morning since before the alarm went off. Behind her, moving with the particular careful deliberateness of a man who is both under cooperative custody and aware that events have moved beyond what custody means in the current context, was Dumbledore. He looked at the chamber. He looked at Quirrell sitting on the floor. He looked at Harry standing in the middle of it all with his wand in his hand and something on his face that was neither triumph nor relief but simply the particular focus of someone who has done a difficult thing and is already thinking about what comes next. "You drove him out," Dumbledore said, looking at Harry. "For now," Harry said. "He'll reconstitute. Probably faster than last time because he's had more recent practice. But the fragments," he pressed his hand briefly to his own chest, pushed back. He couldn't maintain the connection to Quirrell with all 38 of them actively resisting him. Dumbledore was looking at him with an expression Harry had not seen on his face before. Not warmth, not strategy, not the carefully constructed sincerity of someone managing an interaction. Something stripped back. Something that might have been, in a man less armored, wonder. "The fragments," Dumbledore said. "They responded to your will." "They're mine," Harry said simply. "They've been mine for 11 years. Whatever anyone intended, that's what happened." Dumbledore looked at the mirror, still standing against the far wall, the stone visible in the reflection, untouched. "You didn't take it," he said. "No. You could have." "I know." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "Why not?" "Because the stone solves the wrong problem," Harry said. "The problem isn't Voldemort's current state. The problem is his Horcruxes, the actual ones, the objects, the things that anchor him to existence. As long as those exist he can't be finished. The stone would just make the current situation more dramatic without making it more solvable." He looked at Quirrell, who was being helped to a seated position against the wall by McGonagall with the careful efficiency of someone treating a patient they're simultaneously planning to arrest. "Quirrell has the locations," Harry said. "Or most of them. And some of them are in the map he built into me. We have a complete picture if we combine what he knows and what's in the fragments." He looked at Dumbledore. "You know some of them too. The ones you'd already found." "A diary," Dumbledore said quietly. "A ring. I suspected a locket. I had theories about a cup, a diadem, and a snake," Harry said, from the knowledge in the fragments. "Nagini. His familiar. Made into a Horcrux later, more recent, unstable." He paused. "And me. 7 original, plus whatever Quirrell added, plus the anchor in me that's been there since I was a baby." Dumbledore was listening with the absolute attention of a man who is discovering that someone else has mapped the territory he thought only he knew. "If we have all the locations," Harry said, "and a method for dealing with the originals, a basilisk's venom," Dumbledore said. Or fiend fire. There are very few things capable of destroying a Horcrux object. Fortunately, Harry said, and something in the fragments oriented him toward a specific room, a specific memory of where something enormous lived in this very school. There's a basilisk in the building. McGonagall looked up from Quirrell. There is absolutely not a chamber of secrets, Harry said. Salazar Slytherin's private installation. The entrance is in the girls' bathroom on the second floor. He paused, and then, because it was accurate, I can find it. I can open it. Parseltongue, that's one of the things the fragments gave me. The chamber was extremely quiet. You speak Parseltongue, McGonagall said. Yes, Harry said. Since whenever the original 7 fragments settled. McGonagall looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked at Harry. Harry looked at the mirror, still standing patient and waiting, showing him the stone in his own pocket, waiting for someone to want it badly enough in the right direction. We have, Harry said, turning back to the room, a complete solution available to us. All the information, all the tools, a cooperative witness. He glanced at Quirrell, and the anchor in me that can help Voldemort be drawn to a specific point when the time comes. He paused. What we don't have is trust. Between the people in this room and the Ministry. Between Dumbledore and everyone else. Between what was planned and what was built and what actually needs to happen. He looked at each of them in turn. McGonagall, solid and increasingly committed to the reality in front of her rather than the one she thought she was in. Dumbledore, processing with the speed of a mind that had spent 70 years being the most capable one in any room and was now working out what that meant when you weren't. Quirrell, exhausted against the wall, who had made 30 years of wrong choices for reasons that were not entirely without substance and was now in the position of someone whose plan had been taken apart and reassembled by the very mechanism he'd built. So this morning, Harry said, we're going to have a meeting. Proper, formal, everyone in the room, everything on the table. And then the Wisengamot session this afternoon is going to have a different agenda than the one that was planned, because we're going to walk in there with a complete strategy instead of a damage report. He looked at Dumbledore specifically. And you're going to tell them everything. Not the managed version. Not the version where some things are too complicated for other people to understand. Everything. Dumbledore held his gaze. In the purple firelight he looked old and very human and not, for once, like a wizard at all, just a man who had built a very large, very complicated thing and was standing in the wreckage of its partial collapse, recognizing that the person who might be able to put it together correctly was someone he'd spent years keeping small. Everything, Dumbledore said. Yes, Harry said. Starting with the prophecy. The formal morning meeting happened in Dumbledore's office at 8 o'clock, which gave them 2 hours before McGonagall had to notify the Ministry of the previous night's events and 4 hours before the Wisengamot session. Croker arrived at 7:30, having been summoned by Bones who had been notified by McGonagall, and he brought 2 assistants and his notebook and the particular focused energy of someone who has been given new information at 3 in the morning and has spent the hours since then processing it into action. Bones was already there. She had, Harry suspected, not slept at all, but showed it only in the very slight tightness around her eyes, which on a different face might have been exhaustion and on hers read as concentration. Quirrell was present, warded, with 2 Ministry Aurors at the door, not because he was physically dangerous in his current state but because he was a man who had just had Voldemort removed from his head and needed both medical monitoring and legal documentation. He sat in his chair with the slightly hollow look of someone newly emptied of something enormous, and answered questions when asked and offered information when it was useful and did not, Harry noted, try to manage the situation or minimize what he'd done. Harry sat at the center of the table. Hermione was to his left with a full notebook and the expression of someone watching history being made and determined to document it accurately. Ron was to his right and had a plate of toast that McGonagall had conjured from somewhere, which Harry ate pieces of throughout the meeting because breakfast had been somewhat bypassed. Dumbledore was at the table too. The provisional restrictions of his cooperative custody were still technically in place, but the context had shifted sufficiently that their enforcement felt beside the point. He sat with his hands folded and a quietness about him that wasn't defeat exactly, it was the quietness of someone who has made a decision to be fully honest and is experiencing the strange lightness of no longer maintaining the alternative. The prophecy, Bones said. Let's start there. Dumbledore nodded and recited it. His voice was even and the words fell into the room with the weight of things that have shaped enormous choices. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. And the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. Silence. Power the Dark Lord knows not, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore said. I always believed this meant love. The protective magic your mother performed, it might mean that, Harry said. It might also mean exactly what happened in the chamber last night. He couldn't hold on because the fragments pushed back, and the fragments pushed back because they're mine, and they're mine because of what 11 years of lived experience does to anything that lives inside a person long enough. He paused. He put pieces of himself in objects because he didn't trust people. He couldn't imagine that a piece of himself could become something that didn't serve him, because he couldn't imagine genuine autonomous will in anything he'd created. He looked at the table. That's the knowledge he doesn't have. Not love, specifically. The understanding that things you make can grow beyond what you made them to be and choose differently than you intended. Flitwick, who had arrived quietly at some point and was sitting in the corner with his legs not quite reaching the floor and his face doing the expression of someone watching a first-year explain something that took him 40 years to understand, said nothing but wrote something in his own small notebook. The Horcruxes, Bones said. Dumbledore provided what he knew. Quirrell added to it, and the combination was comprehensive. Between them, they accounted for 7 Horcrux objects beyond what already rested in Harry. The diary, the ring, the locket, the cup, the diadem, the snake. The diary had been passed to someone, Dumbledore believed, for safekeeping. He looked at his own hands when he said this, and Harry filed it away. The ring was in a house in Little Hangleton and was heavily cursed. The locket had been moved from a cave, but its current location was uncertain. The cup was in Gringotts. The diadem was in the school. In the school, McGonagall said. In the room of requirement, Dumbledore said. Hidden among thousands of objects by someone who didn't know what it was. Harry felt the fragments orient toward this, confirming, adding detail. I can find it, he said. The fragments know the diadem signature. I can locate it without searching. Croker was writing everything down with the absorbed efficiency of someone who had given up being surprised and was now simply harvesting information as fast as it could be produced. The diary, Harry said, looking at Dumbledore. You said it was passed to someone for safekeeping. Who? Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Albus, McGonagall said quietly, and there was a specific quality in how she said his name, not the tone of someone asking, but the tone of someone informing him that the old protocols no longer applied. It was given to Lucius Malfoy, Dumbledore said. He doesn't know what it is. He thinks it's an object of dark power that Voldemort entrusted to him as a mark of confidence. He paused. He's been keeping it for 14 years. Harry thought about Lucius Malfoy in the Wizengamot chamber, trying to have him classified as a dark artifact, and thought that the world was occasionally very elegantly symmetrical. We can deal with that through official channels, Bones said, and the precise flatness of her voice communicated without elaboration exactly what official channels was going to look like for Lucius Malfoy. The ring is more urgent, Quirrell said, speaking up from his warded chair. It's not just a Horcrux. Dumbledore, he looked at him, the ring has the resurrection stone set in it. And the stone is cursed. If you attempt to destroy the Horcrux without first neutralizing the curse will spread through whoever is holding the wand. It killed the previous owner and it will kill. I know about the curse, Dumbledore said quietly. You were going to handle it yourself, Quirrell said. Yes. Without telling anyone. A pause. Yes. McGonagall turned to look at him, and her expression was the expression of someone who has just watched a pattern reveal itself that explains a very long series of confusing things. "Albus," she said. "Have you been planning to die?" The office was very still. Dumbledore looked at his hands. "I have been planning to be," he started. "Have you been planning to die?" McGonagall said, and her voice was so precisely level that it was its own answer. "The curse on the ring," Dumbledore said carefully, "would have been manageable. Contained. I had plans to. You were going to put the ring on," Hermione said suddenly, from Harry's left, and everyone looked at her and she had the expression of someone who has worked out the equation and doesn't like the result. "You were going to use the resurrection stone. And the curse you'd have had months. Not years. And you knew that when you planned to." She looked at her notebook and then at Harry and then at Dumbledore. "The prophecy says one must die at the hand of the other. You were planning Harry to be the one who survived, but you also needed yourself to, Hermione," Harry said. She stopped. Harry looked at Dumbledore. "Were you going to tell me any of this? Any of the plan? The prophecy, the Horcruxes, what it was going to require of me? Were you going to explain it, ever? Or was I just going to?" He stopped, and the thing that came through his voice for the first time was not anger but something more honest than anger, something that required more vulnerability, the specific hurt of someone who has been treated as a mechanism rather than a person by someone who should have known better. Dumbledore met his eyes, and whatever he was as a fortress, as a constructed persona, as a man who had spent decades being the most necessary person in a room, it wasn't sufficient to carry him through this look unchanged. "I was going to tell you," Dumbledore said. "When you were 17. 6 years from now," Harry said. "Yes. And in the meantime in the meantime you would have lived," Dumbledore said, and his voice cracked on the word, just slightly, the crack in old stone that reveals the much older stone beneath it. "You would have had years of school and friendships and magic and the things a child deserves to have, and then at 17, Harry said, "you would have told me I needed to die." The word in the room was absolute. "Not die," Dumbledore said, and his voice was the voice of someone who has been maintaining a distinction for years and is discovering, in the light of other people's understanding, that the distinction doesn't hold the weight he put on it. "Walk into death. Allow it to happen. The fragment in you, the one from that night, the 7th original, it would be destroyed, and you might survive," Harry said. "The magic is uncertain, might survive," Harry said. "You were going to ask a 17-year-old to walk into death on a might." Dumbledore had no answer for this. Harry sat back in his chair and let the silence be what it was. Around the table no one moved. Croker's pen had stopped writing. Ron's toast had been forgotten. McGonagall's face was the face of someone who has just received the final piece of a puzzle and found that the completed image is worse than any of the partial versions. "The thing I find most," Harry started, and then stopped, and took a breath, and said what was actually true, "the thing I find most difficult about this isn't the plan. I understand the plan. I understand that you believed it was necessary and I understand that you believe you were protecting me by not telling me. I even understand that by some measures you probably were." He looked at Dumbledore steadily. "What I find difficult is that you made it impossible for me to choose. The plan only works if I don't know about it in time to object. So you built the plan around my ignorance and called the ignorance protection." Dumbledore looked at him, and in his eyes was something that had not been there at the beginning of the morning, the particular expression of a person who has been genuinely seen, possibly for the first time in a very long time, and found the experience both painful and necessary. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "Yes," Harry said. "And now we're going to do it differently." The Wizengamot session that afternoon was unlike anything that Chamber had hosted in living memory. They went in with a complete strategy, a full account of the previous night, a cooperative material witness, and a 23-page brief that Hermione had produced between 8 and 11 that morning and that Croker had described, with the closest thing to reverence his personality could generate, as functionally complete. Ogden called the session to order with the particular careful authority of a man who has been told by 3 different people that today would be exceptional and has prepared himself appropriately. Harry spoke first. He laid out the previous night clearly, quickly, without embellishment or drama: Quirrell, the stone, Voldemort's presence, the resolution. He described what the fragments had allowed him to do and how he had done it. He listed every Horcrux object and its location with the calm precision of someone reciting a memorized list. He explained the plan, a coordinated ministry operation to retrieve and destroy the Horcrux objects, using basilisk venom from the Chamber of Secrets as the destruction method, with Harry present for the final phase when Voldemort would be drawn to the accumulated fragments and could be permanently ended. Then he said, "I'm volunteering for this. Not being volunteered. I understand what it involves and I'm choosing to do it. That's the difference between this plan and the previous one." The chamber was very quiet. Then Dumbledore, from his seat, no longer at the high table but on the floor of the chamber, in the witness position, stripped of his institutional authority by the architecture of the session itself, began to speak. What followed was the most extraordinary 3 hours the Wizengamot had experienced in 40 years. Dumbledore's account was complete, unflinching, and delivered with a clarity that bypassed his usual rhetorical architecture entirely, the warmth and the framing and the carefully positioned context all absent, replaced by the specific dignity of a man who has decided that being entirely honest is the only thing he has left to offer. He described knowing about the soul fragments since the night Harry was placed with the Dursleys. He described the suppressors and their purpose. He described the prophecy and his interpretation of it. He described, with precision that clearly cost him, the plan for Harry's death that he had been moving toward for 10 years. He did not mitigate any of it. When Malfoy attempted to interrupt, framing the revelation about the Horcrux plan as proof of Dumbledore's unfitness, Harry cut across him with a directness that produced an audible reaction in the chamber. "What Professor Dumbledore did was wrong," Harry said, in multiple specific and significant ways that this session has documented. "But he is the most knowledgeable living person about Voldemort's nature and methods, and we need that knowledge. Removing him from the process entirely satisfies a desire for punishment but damages the outcome. I'm suggesting accountability plus continued contribution, which is a different thing from either full exoneration or full removal." He looked around the chamber. "Unless anyone in this room believes that feeling clean is more important than finishing the work." Nobody said anything. Malfoy sat down. The vote on the operational plan passed 141 to 47. The formal charges against Dumbledore were maintained, they would be dealt with after the immediate threat was addressed, not instead of it. Quirrell's status as a cooperative material witness was formally acknowledged, with the specific language about consideration of cooperation in sentencing that Harry had asked for. Harry was formally named as a participating decision-maker in the anti-Voldemort operation, with protected status and the explicit right of informed consent regarding anything done to his person or his magical core. Ogden signed the last document and looked up. "Is there anything else before we adjourn?" he said. Harry looked around the chamber, at Bones with her files and her monocle and her absolute professional reliability, at Croaker who had been writing for 3 hours and showed no signs of stopping, at the faces of 200 witches and wizards who had spent the morning learning that the world they thought they knew had been running on a different set of rules than the ones they'd been told, at Dumbledore in the witness chair, old and honest and accountable in a way he'd perhaps never fully been before, at McGonagall in the gallery with Hermione and Ron beside her, Hermione's notebook full and Ron's expression full of something that looked a great deal like pride. "No," Harry said. "I think that covers it for today." He walked out of the chamber into the ministry corridor, and the grey London light came through the atrium ceiling, and the fireplaces moved their usual traffic of witches and wizards going about the mechanics of a magical world, and in his chest the fragments hummed their familiar chord, quieter now, the terror in them slightly less absolute, as though even old fear, carried long enough by someone who refused to be afraid, might begin, slowly, to change. Chapter 6. The boy who chose 3 weeks after the Wizengamot session, on a Tuesday morning that smelled like turned earth and coming rain, they went to retrieve the ring. Harry stood at the edge of a field in Little Hangleton with Bones on his left and Dumbledore on his right and a team of 6 Aurors spread out behind them, all of them looking at a derelict house that had been abandoned long enough to become a statement about abandonment. The sky overhead was low and greenish, the kind of sky that means weather in the next hour, and the grass around the house grew in the way grass grows when it's been left alone long enough to make decisions about itself. "The curse," Harry said to Dumbledore, not looking at him. "Walk me through it again." "It responds to desire," Dumbledore said. "Specifically the desire to use the stone. The resurrection stone can call back the dead, not truly, not as they were, but something adjacent enough to be devastating. The curse exploits the moment of that desire. When the ring is touched by someone who wants what the stone offers, it opens a door into the wanting," Harry said. "Yes. And the wanting kills you. It begins a process," Dumbledore said carefully. "One that, without intervention, concludes in death." Harry felt the fragments orient toward the house with the particular attention they brought to objects that carried Voldemort's signature. The ring was in there, and it was old and cold and very certain of itself. "I don't want to call back the dead," Harry said. "No," Dumbledore said. "I know. So the curse won't activate." "In theory." Harry looked at him sideways. "How confident are you in the theory?" Dumbledore paused for a fraction of a second too long. "Reasonably." "Right," Harry said, and walked toward the house. The Aurors moved to follow and Bones made a gesture that held them. She looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked at the back of Harry's head, moving through the long grass, and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. Harry had been briefed. Harry understood the risk. Harry had said, in the planning meeting 2 days ago, that he would go first because he was the only person in the group for whom the curse had no lever to pull. "I don't want to bring anyone back," he'd said at that meeting, very simply. "I didn't know my parents. I grieve that, but I don't fantasize about reversing it. I don't have the specific kind of longing that the stone feeds on." He'd looked around the room. "Everyone else here does." Nobody had argued, because he was right, and because Harry had a particular quality when he said true things of making the room understand that arguing would be arguing with the truth rather than with him. The house was worse inside than outside. It had the specific decay of a place that was abandoned before anyone had finished wanting something from it, broken furniture and broken dishes and the cold concentrated silence of somewhere that hadn't been warm in decades. Harry found the ring in a cabinet in the upper room. It was in a small box that had been placed under a floorboard with the specific care of someone who understood that it was important and wanted it both accessible and not obviously so. He could feel it from the doorway, not malevolent exactly, but dense, carrying the weight of something that had been forced to hold more than it wanted to. He crouched beside the floorboard and looked at the ring without touching it. The stone in the setting was black with a crack running through it, and when Harry looked at it he could feel the two things it held, the Horcrux fragment in the gold of the band, cold and insistent, and the resurrection stone's particular quality in the cracked gem, which was, he considered it carefully, longing. The stone itself was made of distilled longing. It was the magical crystallization of every person who had ever wanted the dead back. He thought of his parents. He thought about them not as people he remembered but as a shape in the world they'd left, a scar on his forehead, 38 fragments of their killer, a description in a prophecy, and the persistent sense that the lives he hadn't been able to live because they'd died were lives he was building anyway, from different materials. He didn't want them back. He wanted them to have lived. Those were different desires, and the stone could only serve one of them. He picked up the ring. Nothing happened, except that the Horcrux fragment in it reacted to his presence the way all the Horcrux fragments reacted to him now, orienting, turning toward him, recognizing the larger collection he carried with the same dumb attraction of something finding its own kind. He felt it trying to integrate itself with the fragments in his chest, and he held it separate with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 3 weeks understanding exactly how his own magical core worked. He carried it downstairs and out of the house into the greenish morning light and gave it to Croaker, who had a lead-lined case prepared for exactly this and sealed it with 3 different containment charms before breathing again. Venom first, Harry said. Then we deal with what's inside the stone. The resurrection stone was the part that worried everyone except Harry. You couldn't destroy it, or rather, destroying it would require destroying the Hallow itself, which Dumbledore was resistant to and Harry was indifferent to but which the Department of Mysteries had very strong opinions about. The compromise they'd reached was containment, a permanent stasis field developed by Croaker and two of his colleagues that would hold the stone's properties inert indefinitely. Harry watched Croaker apply the basilisk venom to the ring's band and watched the Horcrux destroy itself with the sound that all the Horcrux objects made, a scream that was not a sound, a suggestion of a scream, the magical equivalent of something that was never supposed to exist ceasing to. He felt the corresponding fragment inside him shift slightly, as though a compass needle had moved. The stone was sealed. The ring was destroyed. They went back to London. The next 3 weeks were the most organized period of Harry's life, which was not a high bar given that his previous 11 years had been organized around other people's convenience rather than any actual system, but which felt significant regardless. The diary came out of Malfoy Manor via a ministry raid that Bones conducted with the particular satisfaction of someone who had wanted to do this for some time and was finally authorized. Lucius Malfoy, when presented with documentation of what he'd been unknowingly housing for 14 years, went through several emotional stages rapidly: shock, denial, the beginning of outrage, and then seemed to calculate something and became very cooperative, which Harry suspected meant the cooperation was a different kind of strategy and filed it away accordingly. The locket took longer. It had been moved from its original location, a cave on the coast that Dumbledore had found through a year of research and that Harry had confirmed through the fragment's knowledge, and tracking it required a combination of Dumbledore's networks and Croaker's instruments and, eventually, a very uncomfortable conversation with a house elf named Creature who turned out to have taken it. Harry handled that conversation himself, because Creature responded to kindness with a bewildered gratitude that the elf seemed to find almost personally offensive, but eventually managed. The locket was retrieved from Grimmauld Place, a house that Harry would need to think about more carefully in the future because it was apparently his, which was another piece of information that had been sitting in a file somewhere waiting for him to exist properly enough to receive it. The cup in Gringotts required a different approach entirely. Goblins, Dumbledore explained in a briefing that Harry attended along with Bones and 2 senior ministry officials, did not respond well to either demands or requests, but had a very specific relationship with the concept of rightful ownership, and if the object being requested was being reclaimed by someone with a legal claim to access the vault, whose vault is it? Harry asked. The Lestrange family vault, Dumbledore said. And Bellatrix Lestrange is in Azkaban, Harry said. Yes. For crimes that include, extensive crimes, Dumbledore said. So the vault's contents could be held pending legal resolution of those crimes, Harry said, looking at Bones. Technically, Bones said, with the expression of someone seeing a door she hadn't noticed before. And during a legal hold, ministry representatives with appropriate authority could access the contents for purposes of inventory and evidence gathering, Harry said. Bones looked at him. That is technically correct, she said. I'd like to be part of that inventory team, Harry said. Bones looked at him for a moment longer. Then she opened her briefing file to a new page and started writing. The cup was retrieved on a Thursday, from a vault 3 miles underground, by a ministry inventory team that included Bones, Croaker, 2 goblins who had negotiated very specific terms for their cooperation, and Harry, who was listed on the official paperwork as an advisory consultant with specialist knowledge of the inventory subject and who experienced his first and deeply unpleasant encounter with a thestral-drawn cart at high speed underground. He destroyed the cup's Horcrux himself, with a basilisk fong that Croaker had mounted in a containment handle specifically for this purpose, and felt the corresponding fragment shift again. The diadem was in the room of requirement. Harry found it on a Saturday afternoon with Ron and Hermione, navigating a room the size of a cathedral filled with decades of accumulated hidden things, broken furniture and forgotten books and objects shoved out of sight by students who had never come back for them. He found it not by searching but by letting the fragments orient him the way they oriented toward all the Horcrux objects now, compass needles pointing north. It was on a stone bust of a warlock with a wig, resting there with the casual incongruity of something valuable placed by someone who didn't understand its value and was hiding it for trivial reasons. He picked it up. Hermione was beside him immediately, basilisk fang in the containment handle, ready. "I can do it," Harry said. "I know you can," Hermione said. "Do you want to?" He thought about this. He did want to, in the sense that it was his search, his problem, his life rearranged around it. But he also thought about what it meant to have people beside him and decided that using them was not weakness. "Yes," he said. "But you stay here while I do it." She stayed. He destroyed it. It screamed in a non-sound way. Ron, from behind a stack of old chairs, said, "One more object." "Then the snake." "Then the snake," Harry agreed. The snake was the difficult one. Nagini was not an object. She was an animal who had been made into a Horcrux without her consent, which Harry thought was the part of Voldemort's biography that he found most specifically contemptible, not the killings, which were monstrous in scale, but the casual instrumentalization of a living creature that hadn't chosen any of it. He understood that feeling from the inside. More practically, she was dangerous, she was large, she was devoted to Voldemort with the devotion of a creature whose will had been partially subsumed by the fragment she carried, and she was currently somewhere in England with Voldemort's remnant presence directing her. The strategy for Nagini was the part of the plan that had taken longest to develop and that Harry had spent the most time thinking about. He could speak to her. That was the beginning of it. He found her through the fragment's sensitivity to Horcrux signatures. She was in a house in Yorkshire that had been empty for 6 months, and the Aurors had the perimeter secured by the time Harry arrived with Dumbledore and Bones and a Ministry snake handler whose expression clearly communicated that this was significantly outside his usual professional scope. Harry walked through the perimeter. The Aurors started moving to stop him and Bones made a gesture and they held. He found her in the kitchen, coiled under the table, her scales pale in the grey light through dirty windows. She was watching the door when he came through it. He crouched down and said, in Parseltongue, "I know you didn't choose this." She was still for a long moment. "The fragment in you," he said. He put it there. "You didn't agree." A very long silence. Her tongue moved. When she spoke, it was with the specific quality of something that had been carrying a weight for so long it had forgotten what it felt like to put it down. "No. It's hurting you," he said. "Carrying it. I know because I carry them too. 38 of them. But mine have become mine. Yours hasn't. Yours is still his and it wants things you don't want and it's been trying to make you want them." Her head moved slightly. "Yes. I can take it from you," he said. "But I need you to choose it. I can't do it against your will, it doesn't work that way." Another long silence. He could feel Dumbledore and Bones and the entire perimeter team watching from outside the window, watching a 12-year-old boy crouched in a dusty kitchen having a conversation with a large snake in a language they mostly couldn't understand. "Will it hurt?" she asked. "Probably," he said. "Yes. But less than carrying it forever." She looked at him with her ancient golden eyes for a long moment. Then she said, "All right." He put his hand on her scales. Her magic aligned with his the way Quirrell's had, the way the fragments aligned with each other, and he pulled, and the fragment came free, and Nagini made a sound that was not a sound, a release rather than a scream, and then she was still under his hand, breathing, her head on the kitchen floor. He took the fragment and he held it separate from the others, distinct, and he brought the containment vial out of his pocket and sealed it inside. Croaker would destroy it. Harry had carried enough. He stood up. "Thank you," he told Nagini. She looked up at him. "Go finish it," she said. He went outside. Dumbledore looked at him. Harry held up the vial. Dumbledore closed his eyes for a moment. "That's all of them," Harry said. "Except what's in me." The last phase of the plan was the one that Harry had built himself, with input from Hermione's theory and Croaker's instruments and Dumbledore's knowledge of Voldemort's psychology, and it depended on something that nobody had fully understood until Harry had spent 3 weeks living with the fragments and learning their architecture. The fragments wanted to reconstitute. They had always wanted to reconstitute. It was their nature. Horcrux pieces were homing devices, oriented toward the hole they'd been split from, always trying to find their way back. In Harry, for 11 years, they'd been building towards something, and the suppression of that impulse was part of what the suppressors had been for. Without the suppressors, without the destroyed objects to dilute the pull, with Voldemort's remnant presence in England and getting weaker by the day as the objects it was anchored to ceased to exist, the pull was very strong. Harry could feel it. Not as a compulsion, it was information, a direction, like knowing which way north is. The fragments wanted to go. He was holding them, the way you hold a compass rather than following it. He had been holding them for 3 weeks. The operational plan was simple in outline. Harry would stop holding them, in a controlled environment, with the entire Ministry Counterdark Task Force positioned around the location where Voldemort would be drawn. When the fragments moved toward reconstitution and Voldemort was drawn to them, the resulting presence would be physical enough to be destroyed by the accumulated basilisk venom Croaker had been preparing, delivered at sufficient concentration by Flitwick's enhancement charms. The location was Hogwarts. Harry's idea. The castle had wards that could be oriented against Voldemort's remnant, the founders had built them that way, and the hat had told Harry exactly how to activate that orientation. The timing was Harry's call. That had been non-negotiable. When you're ready, Bones had said, in the final planning session, you tell us. Not when the ministry is ready or when the operation is optimally positioned. When you are ready. Harry had looked at her. I'm ready now, he'd said. Then we move tomorrow morning, she'd said. The morning was clear, which felt wrong in the way that very significant days are sometimes wrong about their weather, the castle against a blue sky, the grounds fresh with September light, the lake so still it looked like it had been painted. Harry ate breakfast. He was the only person in the Great Hall who ate a full breakfast, which he thought was appropriate because he'd thought about this carefully and fueling was correct preparation and anxiety was not. Hermione sat beside him and didn't eat and didn't say anything, which was right. Ron ate toast and made occasional remarks about Quidditch that had nothing to do with the morning and everything to do with the specific kindness of giving someone something ordinary to be with. McGonagall came to the table at 8. The task force is in position, she said. Flitwick is ready with the wards. Croaker has the delivery system deployed. She paused. The aura perimeter is 300 meters. No one in or out of that range except the people on this table and the essential team. Dumbledore? Harry said. At the edge of the perimeter. He asked to be present. A pause. I told him he could watch. Harry nodded. That's right, he said. He put down his fork and stood. Harry, Hermione said. He looked at her. She had, apparently, spent some part of last night composing something to say and had been trying to find the right moment. He could see the composition process on her face, the careful selection of words, the rejection of inadequate ones. Then she seemed to decide that the careful version was not the right version. You are the bravest person I have ever met, she said. Not because you're not afraid of anything. Because you look at the things that should frighten you and you decide to understand them instead. And that's actually much harder. Harry looked at her for a moment. I'll be back for lunch, he said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Ron clapped him once on the shoulder. Obviously, he said. Harry walked out of the Great Hall, through the entrance hall, and out onto the steps of the castle. The grounds were clear of students. McGonagall had managed that with the particular efficiency she brought to managing large numbers of people who didn't know why they were being moved. The sky was enormous overhead and the lake was still and the morning smelled like Scotland in September, which Harry was coming to associate with the specific quality of being in a place where things were possible. He walked to the center of the grounds, where the grass was level and the wards Flitwick had adjusted hummed in the stone beneath his feet and in the air around him with the deep regular frequency of something very old being asked to do the thing it had always been designed to do. He stopped. He felt the 38 fragments in his chest, their familiar chord. He knew them now, not just as knowledge but as presences, distinct, each one's content familiar. He had spent weeks in them and they had spent 11 years in him, and whatever they were his, and choosing to release them was a genuine choice rather than a loss. He thought, you were afraid of dying and it made you into something that couldn't live. He thought, I'm not afraid of anything you put in me. He thought, go. He released the fragments. Not all at once, it wasn't like uncorking a bottle. It was more like opening a fist that had been closed for a long time, finger by finger, each release deliberate. The fragments moved with the accumulated force of 38 homing devices finally pointed at their source, and the world around Harry went electric with the specific quality of magic happening at a scale that the grounds had not hosted since 1943. He felt them leave. He felt the space they left. It was very large. He had expected to feel diminished. He didn't. He felt specific. Precise. Himself in the exact shape of himself without any other shapes in the way, and the shape was smaller than he'd thought but it was entirely his own, and there was something in that which was not emptiness but clarity. The air in front of him began to change. This was the part no one had been entirely sure about, the exact mechanics of a Horcrux remnant being drawn to a concentration of its own fragments. Voldemort had done this before, finding Quirrell's body, but the circumstances then had been different. This was a deliberate draw, fragments offered rather than found, and the question was whether the remnant would come to Harry or simply to the location. It came to Harry. It came the way cold comes into a room, not all at once but everywhere simultaneously, the temperature dropping and the light going slightly wrong and the specific sensation of something enormous and very determined pressing against the boundary of the physical world, pushing to get through. Harry stood in it and did not move. He felt the 38 fragments somewhere ahead of him, between him and the presence, pulled toward their source, and he felt the wards humming through the ground, and he felt in the distance behind him the task force with everything Croker had prepared, and he thought, now. He said it aloud too, because some things need words, now. What Flitwick and Croker had built together was, as Croker had described it in the planning meeting, a delivery system for the concentrated basilisk venom that combined the precision of 7th-level charms work with the raw power of industrial-grade magical engineering. It would be used exactly once and then never again because there was no other thing in the world that required exactly this. It worked in 3 seconds. The presence in the air screamed. It was not a non-sound this time. It was the sound, loud and singular and without any of the qualities of a human voice, a frequency that bypassed the ears entirely and arrived in the chest, in the bones, in the parts of a person below ordinary sensation. The wards took up the sound and transmitted it through the ground and the castle behind Harry shook once, like something breathing out. Then there was silence. A very complete silence. The kind that follows the end of something that has been happening for a long time. Harry stood in it and breathed. The fragments were gone. He could not feel them anymore, not the Horcrux fragments, not the presence, not the resonance they'd generated for 11 years. The chest was quiet. Not empty, his own magic was there, fully present, the shape of himself clear and unobstructed. But the cord was gone. Just him. He stood there for a moment. Then he heard footsteps on the grass behind him and Ron's voice saying, "Told you it would work, you were being catastrophically pessimistic," and Hermione's voice saying, "I was being realistically cautious, which is different, and also I was right to be cautious because the theoretical uncertainty around the delivery mechanism," and then they were on either side of him, slightly breathless, having broken through the perimeter the moment the sound stopped. He looked at them. "It worked," Ron said. "Yes," Harry said. "How do you feel?" Hermione said. He thought about this honestly. "Strange," he said. "Not bad. Just a different shape than I'm used to." She nodded, and he could see her filing this alongside everything else in the increasingly large notebook of her understanding of him. Then she said, "Croker is going to want a full debrief. Bones has paperwork. Dumbledore is standing at the perimeter looking," she paused. Looking what? Harry said. Looking like he's not sure he's allowed to come over, she said. Harry turned. At the edge of the cleared zone, at the perimeter marked by the last of the Auror's positions, Dumbledore stood, tall and silver and still in the morning light, watching with his hands folded in front of him and an expression Harry could not read from this distance. He walked over. The Auror stepped aside. Dumbledore watched him come, and when Harry stopped in front of him he said nothing for a moment, in the specific way that nothing is said when the usual vocabulary is insufficient. "It's done," Harry said. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "It is." Harry looked at him. Dumbledore looked back. The morning light fell on both of them with complete indifference. "You're going to stand trial," Harry said. "Properly. Everything you told the Wizengamot, all of it goes into the formal record. The suppressors, the plan, the 11 years. It gets dealt with." "I know," Dumbledore said. "And I'm going to testify," Harry said. "I'm not going to make it worse than it was. But I'm not going to make it better either." "I wouldn't ask you to," Dumbledore said. Harry looked at him for a moment longer. "You made me to be a sacrifice," he said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a fact, the last one that needed saying aloud between them. "And I chose to be something else. I think that's the difference between us, in the end. You look at a person and see what they're useful for. I'm going to spend the rest of my life choosing what I'm useful for myself." Dumbledore was quiet. The morning moved around them, wind off the lake, the castle breathing, the distant sounds of the Auror team beginning their debrief. "You are," Dumbledore said finally, "extraordinary." He said it with the specific weight of someone who has used words strategically for 70 years and is choosing, this once, to simply mean them. "Not because of what I made you. Because of what you made of what I made you." Harry considered this. "That's very nearly an apology," he said. "It is one," Dumbledore said. "As complete as I know how to make it." "Good," Harry said. "Work on making them better." He turned and walked back across the grounds. The formal debriefing took 4 hours. Croker measured the complete absence of Horcrux resonance in Harry's core with the counter and confirmed, one magical entity. Harry's own. He took so many notes that he went through 2 notebooks and started on a third, and at the end he looked at Harry and said, with the closest thing to warmth that Croker's personality generated, "The literature doesn't have anything like you." "I know," Harry said. "You said that before. It's still true. Write better literature," Harry said. Bones's paperwork took another 2 hours. Official statements, formal confirmations of each Horcrux destruction event, Harry's account of the fragment release and the remnant's final end, signed and sealed and witnessed and filed in ways that ensured it would be the definitive record regardless of what anyone later tried to make of it. Harry signed everything, read everything before signing it, and corrected 2 things that were inaccurate, which Bones took without comment, corrected, and reissued. At 4 o'clock Harry was in the room of requirement, which he'd found a week ago had a secondary function beyond hiding things. It could become what you actually needed rather than just what you asked for, and what Harry asked for was a room that was empty and quiet with a large window and a comfortable chair, and that was what he got. He sat in the chair and looked out the window at the lake going gold in the late afternoon light and felt the shape of himself. His magic was remarkable. Croker had said as much in the debrief, in the measured understatement of a man who doesn't exaggerate, with the fragments gone and his own core unobstructed, it was large. Not the expanded configuration of fragments plus core, but his own magic, which had grown around and with the fragments for 11 years and retained the expansion even without them. He was 12 years old and what he could do was not something the curriculum was going to cover for several years. He thought about this practically. He needed to keep learning, needed to build the technical skill to match the raw capacity. He needed to do the 2nd year and the 3rd year and all the years after them, not because they would tell him things he didn't know but because understanding magic from the inside wasn't the same as being able to use it fully, and he had 11 years of catching up to do in the form of lived experience rather than stored knowledge. He needed, he thought, to be a student. An actual one. Present in the school, present in the years, present in the ordinary progression of things rather than always standing at the edge of extraordinary events. He'd been extraordinary enough. There was something he wanted now that was less dramatic. He thought about Ron and Hermione. He thought about the three of them at a table in the library arguing about a transfiguration theory, or walking the grounds in the cold, or sitting in the common room in the ordinary evening, and it seemed like the most appealing thing he could imagine. He thought about Hogwarts, the castle above and around him, alive in the specific way it was alive, full of history and magic and the accumulated presence of everyone who'd ever been here. He had a complicated relationship with this place already and he'd been here less than 2 months. He thought he'd like to develop a less complicated one. There was a knock at the door, which was unusual because the room of requirement wasn't technically supposed to have a door that people knocked on. "Come in," Harry said. "McGonagall." She came in and looked at the room, the empty, comfortable, quiet room he'd made, and something on her face relaxed slightly, the way faces relax when a diagnosis is better than expected. She sat in the chair across from his, which had not been there when he'd asked for the room but which the room had apparently decided was needed. "How are you?" she asked. "Actually good," Harry said, and it was true. "Strange still. But good." "The debrief was thorough," she said. "Croker used the word unprecedented 7 times, which I'm told is a record for him." "He likes accuracy," Harry said. "He does." She looked at him with the careful attention she always brought, the attention that had been recalibrating since the night of the sorting and had now settled into something that was simply genuine. "What do you want?" she asked. "Not what happens next in the investigation or the trial or the ministry process. What do you want?" Harry looked out at the lake. "I want to go to class," he said. "I want to do the homework and argue with Hermione about whether I've done it correctly and learn to fly properly and eat dinner in the Great Hall and have it all be completely boring." He paused. "I want a year that's boring." McGonagall was quiet for a moment. "I think," she said, "that can be arranged." "Not immediately," Harry said. "There's still the trial. And the follow-up with Quirrell's cooperation. And the ministry will want reports on the Horcrux operations for months. And someone needs to make sure Nagini is properly cared for," Harry, McGonagall said. "And the Philosopher's Stone needs to be handled. I think destroying it would be Harry," she said again, and her voice was warm in the specific way it was warm when she was letting herself be warm, which was not often. He stopped. "Those things will happen," she said. "And you will be involved in them because you should be involved in them. But they will happen around your education, not instead of it." She held his eyes. "You are 12 years old. You have done something that no one else in this world could have done. And now you are going to do something equally important." "What's that?" he said. "You are going to be 12, she said. He looked at her. She almost smiled. He almost smiled back. "I don't know what that looks like," he said honestly. "I know," she said. "That's rather the point. You'll work it out." She stood. "Dinner is in 40 minutes. I believe Mr. Weasley and Miss Granger have been waiting in the corridor for approximately an hour." Harry stood. "They didn't need to wait." "No," McGonagall agreed. "They chose to." She moved to the door, paused with her hand on the frame. "Mr. Potter." "Professor." "The Sorting Hat asked me to tell you," she stopped, and he could see her deciding whether to say it exactly as the hat had said it. "What did it say?" Harry asked. "It said, well sorted." Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. A real one, short and genuine, surprised out of him by the accuracy of it, and McGonagall's expression did the thing it rarely did, it became, for just a moment, purely warm. He followed her out of the room of requirement into the corridor where Ron and Hermione were waiting, Ron sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and Hermione standing but close to the floor, both of them looking up when the door opened with expressions that were different in character but identical in their fundamental orientation toward him. "All right?" Ron said. All right, Harry confirmed. They went to dinner. The great hall was full and loud and entirely ordinary, the way it was every evening when several hundred people had been at school all day and were hungry and had things to tell each other that had nothing to do with Horcruxes or trials or the structural vulnerabilities of the wizarding world's institutional trust in powerful men. The candles were lit, the food was good, the ceiling showed early October and its clean dark sky, and Harry sat down and helped himself to potatoes and listened to Ron's very detailed account of why the Chudley cannons last season had been catastrophically managed at the tactical level, which was not a subject Harry had any prior knowledge of but which he found he had opinions about based on Ron's description. Hermione was reading. She always read at dinner, which Harry had decided he found endearing rather than antisocial because she always also managed to participate in conversations while reading, which was genuinely impressive. I've been thinking about the theoretical framework for the fragment integration, she said, not looking up from her book. There's a paper in Croker's files that suggests something about magical core elasticity that might explain why your core retained the expansion rather than contracting after the fragments left. I'd like to write a response. A response to a classified Department of Mysteries paper. Ron said. A theoretical response, she said. For my own understanding. And then maybe you'll publish it under a pseudonym and make Croker's team rethink their entire framework, Harry said. She looked up. Possibly, she said, with the exact expression of someone who has already considered this and decided it's not ruled out. Harry ate his potatoes and looked around the great hall. He looked at the Slytherin table and the Hufflepuff table and the Ravenclaw table and the long familiar red and gold of Gryffindor stretched out on either side of him. He looked at the high table where the professors sat, McGonagall back in her chair, Flitwick gesturing with his fork at something Sprout was saying. Dumbledore's chair was empty and would remain so until the trial was resolved, and the absence was notable but not, Harry thought, wrong. Institutions needed to be able to hold their own to account. That was how they stayed institutions rather than becoming monuments to individuals. He looked at the hat, which he'd left on a shelf in the Gryffindor common room but which had a way of being present even when it wasn't physically in the room. He thought, well sorted and thought about what it meant to be sorted into Gryffindor not for bravery in the traditional sense, charging at dragons, dying for causes, but for the specific bravery of refusing to be afraid of yourself. The thing about the fragments, which he would understand better over time, was that they had given him something no planned education could have, an intimate understanding of what darkness actually was, from the inside, living with it, feeling its shape. He knew what Voldemort had been because he'd felt him, not the mythology, not the terror, but the actual experience of a person who had been so afraid of dying that he'd made himself into something that could barely be called living. He understood it. He had compassion for it, in the way you have compassion for something sad. And he had absolutely no interest in repeating it. The power the Dark Lord knows not, Dumbledore had said. He'd thought it meant love. Harry thought it meant something related to love but more specific, the willingness to understand your own darkness without being defined by it. To carry difficult things and keep choosing. To be made of complicated material and decide, daily, what to do with it. Not a dramatic decision, made once, in a chamber with purple fire. A quiet one. Made at dinner, over potatoes, with your friends arguing about Quidditch beside you and the ceiling showing early October stars. He looked up at the ceiling. The stars were clear and cold and entirely indifferent, the way stars are, and the candlelight moved below them in the warm air of the hall, and Harry Potter, 12 years old, no longer carrying 38 fragments of anyone but himself, with a wand that fit his hand and 2 people worth having and a castle full of things worth learning, ate his dinner and breathed and chose, in the smallest possible way, to be exactly where he was.